Over the pale spires of Valyria, an autumn sun cast its languid light, rippling in amber folds across the endless architecture that marked the beating heart of the freehold. Dragon-shaped weather vanes glimmered atop high towers, each vein representing an ancient bloodline that had risen to power. In the grand mosaic of twisting streets and lofty palaces, House Targaryen remained but one strand in the vast tapestry of old nobility and sorcerous might. Their household grounds were modest compared to the sprawling estates of the older, more esteemed families. Still, the Targaryens retained a certain mystique, if not in political influence, then in their rumored mastery of arcane knowledge, and, of course, their deep bond with dragons. Beneath the Shadowstone arches, where books of forbidden knowledge were sometimes exchanged, a young lord of House Targaryen stood quietly, observing a passing crowd of robed magisters and apprentices. His name was Gaiman, a slender figure with silver gold hair that cascaded to his collarbones, matching the hue of his keen eyes. He watched the bustle of Valyria with a faint smile tugging at his lips, reflecting the curiosity that always simmered in him. The city exuded a humming energy that to Gaiman felt both mesmerizing and disquieting. A living testament to Valyria's centuries of experimentation with fire, blood, and steel. The day's routine had begun like any other, with Gaiman rising before dawn to attend to his father's dragons in the High Mews. Their roars had shaken the sky, echoing above the glistening mosaic rooftops of the Targaryen estate, though only one of the dragons belonged to Gaiman himself, a young she-dragon named Zelirax. Caring for them all was an heir's duty. House Targaryen had never left these lands, had never ventured to the western continent, as some rumor had once suggested they might. Now, with the city at its zenith, Gaiman often caught himself wondering if the myths about faraway places like Westeros really mattered at all. Valyria stood unchallenged, a pillar of knowledge and elemental power, and House Targaryen dwelled comfortably in its shadows, neither the mightiest nor the most lowly, content in the labyrinth of marble halls and arcane secrets. He walked on, the soles of his boots clicking on the polished onyx street. The stench of smoldering pyres drifted in from nearby forges, mingling with the perfumes of exotic spices. In the distance, the mountainous shape of a dragon soared across the haze of the horizon, trailing faint plumes of smoke from its nostrils. The presence of dragons overhead had long been a mundane sight in Valyria. To Gaiman, it was as ordinary as the turning of seasons, and yet, at times, he craved something beyond the city's confines, imagining wide plains or chill seas he had read about in travelers' tomes. He passed a pavilion draped in purple velvet, where an auction of lesser drakes was taking place, and paused to glance at the creatures. Weak-limbed, mewling whelps of questionable lineage, they were sold to lesser houses who hoped to kindle their own fire. A tall man wearing the sigil of House Valyria surveyed the merchandise with a sneer. Gaiman recognized him as Othar Valyria, known for his cruelty to beasts and men alike. Their gazes met, and Othar's lip curled, though he offered no words. Gaiman turned away, ignoring the heated wave of resentment that flickered inside him. At midday, Gaiman wound his way back to the Targaryen compound, nestled near one of Valyria's ancient aqueducts. Steam rose from vents along the building's edges, where geothermal energies were harnessed for warmth and forging. The gates, carved with dragons in flight, admitted him into a central courtyard lined by slender white pillars. In the center of it all, an immense statue depicted the founder of their line, arms outstretched as though beckoning the wind. Gaiman spared it a passing glance before slipping through the grand doors of black stone and into the corridors beyond. The hall was lit by torches of green flame, an elegant display favored by many Valyrian families. At a polished table of ebony sat his father, Lord Orien Targaryen, studying ancient scrolls of genealogies and arcane treatises. Orien's hair was the same silver blonde, but wisps of white had begun to creep in, testifying to his age and the strain of politics. When Gaiman approached, Orien looked up, his expression grave but warm. He gestured for his son to sit. They spoke of trifling matters at first. The usual politicking among the freeholder families, the subtle alliances woven through marriages and trade deals. Then Orien mentioned that House Targaryen had received an intriguing invitation from House Maegor, one of the mightier families, rumored to be close to the Triarchs themselves. They had invited Targaryen representatives to witness a new forging technique, said to blend dragonflame with spells of earthly binding. Orien seemed uncertain, and Gaiman could sense the hesitation. House Targaryen occupied an awkward space in Valyria's social ladder. They were not of the 100 great families, yet not insignificant enough to ignore. The conversation turned to more personal matters. Orien asked about Zelyrax, whether she'd been responding well to the new feeding schedule. Gaiman described the she-dragon's budding confidence and her bold attempts to circle the city walls at dawn. Orien smiled thinly, and in the flickering green torchlight, his face seemed etched by the shadows of worry. Gaiman wondered if his father, too, felt the pull of something beyond these grand towers, beyond the endless swirl of Valyrian intrigues. Perhaps it was only Gaiman's imagination. By the time they finished talking, evening had settled upon Valyria in a haze of molten gold, the light refracting off high rooftops and spires, so that the entire city glimmered like living flame. Gaiman retreated to his chamber, a modest suite high in one of the lesser towers, well away from the main living quarters. Through his arched window, he could see the skies colored in shades of dusky red, the silhouettes of dragons dancing across the horizon. If the histories were true, the families of Valyria once spread their wings across half the known world, conquering and shaping lands to their design. Yet over centuries, their hunger seemed to recede into contentment, and the freehold endured in a state of complicated harmony. As night deepened, he lit a single candle on his desk. Resting beside him was a book, bound in cracked leather, that spoke of distant Westeros. The text was written long ago by a Valyrian traveler named Alexares, who had glimpsed the warring kingdoms of the far west. The notion of unilined monarchs, each ruling their own patch of land without the supervision of a dragon lord, felt surreal. Gaiman read until his eyes grew heavy, sifting through descriptions of the Storm King's fortress battered by wind, of the mighty rock in the west, of the fair-haired rulers of the Reach. None of these kings bent to Valyria. They might pay occasional tribute, or at least avoid direct conflict with the freehold, but they lived their own stories untroubled by the idea of a Targaryen conquest. In the hush that preceded sleep, Gaiman imagined what it would be like to see these foreign shores. He had never asked his father if Targaryens of old had truly considered leaving for Westeros, but the notion of a new horizon teased at his mind. The idea had no place in a stable Valyria, nor did it align with the family's current ambitions, minimal though they were. And yet, in his dreams, he flew Zelyrax across the narrow sea, setting eyes on the unknown. When dawn broke, Gaiman rose and prepared to see to the dragons. The corridors were still quiet, the household not yet stirring. Only a few servants moved about, lighting lanterns against the early gloom. In the mews atop the tower, he found Zelyrax dozing in a pool of morning light. Smoke curled gently from her nostrils. He reached out to stroke the cool scales along her neck, and she rumbled in approval. He thought of the day ahead. There would be further lessons in sorcery, rhetorical training with the tutors his father had hired, and the perpetual pressure to present himself well at gatherings of the more influential families. It felt strange to imagine any other life. Before his father rose, Gaiman ventured out again, craving some solitude. He found his way to the half-deserted library annex near the southwestern edge of their estate. The place smelled of dust and old parchment, its shelves lined with treatises on everything from dragon lore to genealogies and theories of necromancy. There, he came upon a quiet nook where a single window admitted a spear of early sunlight. Seated at a lectern was Alanis, a cousin of his who had taken to the scholarly arts. She glanced up, a faint smile crossing her lips. She asked if Gaiman had come to research anything in particular, and he found himself speaking of Westeros once more. The fascination in his voice made Alanis tilt her head in curiosity. She was older by a few years, with the same pale hair and eyes that shimmered like tempered steel. She shared some of his wanderlust, though she was more devoted to knowledge than travel. Alanis often said there were entire worlds to discover in the spines of books, that she need not cross oceans to taste the unknown. Gaiman admired her perspective, but could not silence the longing in his own chest. They spoke of the Seven Kingdoms, of the rumored Ironborn who raided the seas, and of the green fields in the Reach, fertile beyond measure. Alanis mentioned that some in Valyria regarded Westeros as backward, a land of fractious kings and primitive faiths. Others, however, feared that if the freehold turned too predatory an eye toward the west, the cost might be dear. After all, old Gaiman had been subjugated with fearsome wars, but the process had nearly bankrupted half the families of the freehold. By mid-morning, they parted ways, and Gaiman made his way to the training yard of House Targaryen, a wide courtyard open to the sky. There he practiced swordplay with Aethon, his longtime mentor, who favored a long curved blade forged in the Valyrian style. The clang of steel reverberated across the yard, while the sun rose higher, turning the white pillars bright as gold. Aethon pushed him, testing his reflexes, urging him to blend the fluid grace of a Valyrian duelist with a more direct approach. Gaiman fought fiercely, sweat streaming down his brow, his hair clinging to the edges of his face. At the end of an hour, they paused, panting, the tang of iron heavy in the air. Aethon then spoke of the city's growing tensions. Some families sought to expand the boundaries of Valyrian influence, especially in Essos. There were murmurs of fresh rebellions in Sarnar, of fractious city-states trying to throw off Valyrian oversight. So long as House Targaryen showed loyalty to the wider freehold, they had little to fear. Yet Aethon seemed uneasy, as though the swirling undercurrents were strong enough to pull even an unambitious house into the wave. Gaiman contemplated these warnings in silence. He considered telling his mentor about his daydreams of traveling west, but the words remained unspoken. He could not muster the courage to give voice to something that felt so fantastical, so at odds with the status quo. When the sun began its downward arc, House Targaryen's blackstone halls filled with a subdued hush. Gaiman found himself summoned for a meeting in the Solar, where his father awaited along with 2 members of House Major. In contrast to the simpler attire favored by the Targaryens, these visiting lords wore expensive robes trimmed with shimmering thread. Their confidence was apparent. One introduced himself as Lord Sarian Maegor, the other as his cousin Rialta. Their conversation with Orion revolved around the forging demonstration scheduled for the next fortnight, and they extended an invitation for both Orion and Gaiman to attend. Lord Sarian had a voice as smooth as polished marble. He spoke of how the demonstration would represent the pinnacle of what Valyria could achieve, a new method to embed a blade with runes so potent it might withstand even the breath of a grown dragon. Orion nodded diplomatically. When the conversation drifted into details of arcane forging, Gaiman let his attention wander, his gaze drifting to the window behind them, where late afternoon light fell in quivering bars upon the floor. He wondered if the forging demonstration might bring House Targaryen closer to the center of Valyrian politics. After the major cousins departed, Orion turned to his son with an expression of cautious optimism. He explained that forging alliances with houses like Maegor could elevate their family's standing. Gaiman nodded dutifully, though he recalled the chill he'd felt in Lord Sarian's presence. Ambition could be a double-edged sword, especially in Valyria, where rivalries were often settled with more than mere steel. That evening, as the twilight spread across the city, Gaiman climbed the stairwell to the Mews. Xylyrax waited on the ledge, wings partially unfurled to catch the breeze. From here, Valyria stretched below in a mosaic of labyrinthine streets, flickering with torches and arcane flames. Across the harbor, the reflection of the freehold's towers shimmered against the darkening waters. Gaiman vaulted onto the saddle, strapped between the dragon's ridges, heart pounding with a familiar rush. He guided Xylyrax into the sky, letting the wind sting his cheeks. They circled above the spires, the last light fading at the horizon, and in that moment Gaiman felt truly free. A few other dragons shared the skies, distant shapes gliding over the city. From this vantage, Valyria looked like a fantastic labyrinth, impossible to fully chart. The sense of smallness he experienced was at once humbling and exhilarating. As they soared beyond the outskirts, he glimpsed the farmland that fed the city, fields crisscrossed by irrigation canals. Farther still lay the smoking mountains that had given the freehold its might. Xylyrax let out a deep-throated roar, flames licking at the open air. Gaiman leaned closer to her neck, whispering soothing words. In that stolen interval, he could almost imagine charting a course across the sea. The boundless water beneath them. A new world unfolding over the horizon. But he steered the dragon back, returning to the Targaryen compound before full dark fell. Duty and expectations pulled him homeward. Night came quietly, hushed by the thickness of Valyrian walls. Gaiman dined with his father in the lower hall, the meal simple, fresh fruits, spiced meats, a bit of sweet wine. Orien spoke of preparations for the forging demonstration. Instructions on how Gaiman should comport himself. He was to show respect, to demonstrate knowledge, to avoid overshadowing the elder lords who would be present. The conversation was more paternal guidance than anything else, but an unspoken tension threaded between them. Gaiman suspected his father recognized the restlessness in him, though neither spoke of it. In the days that followed, the city stirred with an undercurrent of anticipation for the upcoming demonstration. House Magyar was known for its flair in hosting grand events, and word spread that they had spared no expense in luring the city's elite to witness the forging of these rumored wonders. Gaiman resumed his routine, training, reading, seeing to Valyrians, and attending carefully to the minute tasks assigned by his father. Yet, in quiet moments, he wandered back to the library, sifting through old texts on foreign lands. Westeros loomed in his mind like a half-forgotten dream. He pored over sketches of heraldry. The rose of House Gardner, the lion of House Lannister, the falcon of House Arryn, the direwolf of House Stark. Each symbol felt like a gateway to some unknown story. A week before the demonstration, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Targaryen gates. Gaiman found himself summoned to the courtyard, where a lean man in weather-beaten clothes waited with a traveling trunk by his feet. He introduced himself as Menador, a clerk who had journeyed across Essos to gather knowledge of distant corners. He bore credentials from several houses, though Targaryen was not among them. Orien received the man with polite courtesy. Menador produced a letter from House Celtigar, a minor house said to dwell on some isles near Westeros, offering trade of certain rare shells and pearls in exchange for Valyrian steel scraps. Orien listened but made no commitment, uncertain how such trifling trade might benefit them. Yet Menador lingered, describing in hushed tones the wonders he had seen in the free cities, the broad Dothraki Sea, and even the storm-lashed coasts near the Seven Kingdoms. Gaiman listened intently, a tightness forming in his chest. Here was a man who had actually glimpsed the lands he had only read about. Menador spoke of the north, where winter ruled half the year, of the deserts of Dorne, and of the labyrinthine ports of Old Town and Lannisport. A hush fell as Gaiman asked question after question, each answer stirring his imagination further. Menador soon departed, leaving behind a swirl of curiosity in Gaiman's mind. He confided in Alanis, who teased him gently, calling him a dreamer. Yet, there was concern in her eyes as she reminded him that House Targaryen was embedded deeply in Valyria. The city could be as much a prison as a paradise. But tradition chained them here, the weight of centuries pressing down. Gaiman nodded, silent, the longing in him refusing to vanish. The day of the forging demonstration arrived at last, and the Targaryen party set out at dawn. Orien insisted they fly, partly for prestige, partly for ease of travel. 3 dragons took wing from the Targaryen towers. Orien's older drake, Carax's, dull bronze in color, Gaiman's Valyrians, gleaming like polished steel under the sun, and one more, ridden by a cousin of the family. The flight was short, the city sprawling beneath them in all its opulence, until they came to land in the wide courtyard of House Magyar's complex. Drums thundered a welcome. Tall marble columns, carved into the likeness of coiling dragons, lined a walkway strewn with fresh petals. The Targaryens were met by servants in shimmering silks, who led them into a pavilion where other noble families had assembled. The forging pit lay at the far end, an immense structure of stone channels and metal scaffolds where red-hot coals glowed. Skilled smiths moved like dancers through the smolder, guided by robed magisters, intoning spells under their breath. Gaiman stood beside his father, feeling the crowd's energy wash over him. The air buzzed with magic, thick enough to taste, and heat radiated from the forge. Lord Serian and Lady Rialta Magyar appeared, greeting their guests with warm smiles, though Gaiman noticed their eyes darting keenly across the assembly. He sensed competition as strong as the furnace's heat, each house vying for recognition in Valyria's shifting hierarchy. The process began with the extraction of molten steel from a crucible, tinted an eerie green from the spells. Magisters chanted incantations, their voices rising above the roar of the flames, weaving runes into the liquid metal. The crowd hushed in awe. Gaiman had watched forging many times, but rarely with such elaborate sorcery. The metal was then poured into a series of molds, each inscribed with glyphs said to amplify the blade's resilience. Sparks danced like fireflies, and the magic sizzled in the air, making the hair on Gaiman's arms stand on end. After a span of hours, the metal cooled enough for the smiths to test. A demonstration was held. The newly forged blade, still glowing faintly with embedded runes, was subjected to dragonflame from a smaller drake that House Magier had on hand. The crowd gasped as the blade did not melt or warp. Instead, it seemed to gather the flames around it, the runes blazing bright as day. Applause broke out, and Lord Syrian basked in the evident success. Amid the fanfare, Orion congratulated the major lords. He nodded for Gaiman to do likewise. As Gaiman expressed his admiration, his gaze wandered to where other houses stood. Valyrian, Bellares, and the storied Cenarian. In their proud stances and quiet whispers, he saw envy, shrewd calculation, and a hunger for power that lurked behind every courteous smile. This was Valyria's heart laid bare. A churn of brilliance and ambition, with each house seeking advantage. After the forging ceremony, the guests were led to a banquet hall, where sumptuous dishes crowded long tables. Wine flowed freely, and illusions danced in the corners, magical phantasms conjured for entertainment. Musicians plucked strings that resonated through the chamber, filling the air with a mesmerizing harmony. Gaiman found himself seated beside a younger major scion named Miria, whose laughter sparkled whenever she teased him about Targaryen modesty. They spoke of their dragons, comparing scales and coloration. Miria had recently claimed a pale green dragon hatchling, though it was not yet large enough to ride. She asked Gaiman about Zelirax, and he found himself growing animated, describing the she-dragon's prowess in flight, her cunning eyes and strong will. As the feast wore on, conversations turned to the broader world. Rumors of tensions across Slaver's Bay, friction with the Dothraki. A few drunken lords speculated about potential expansions. One insisted Valyria's power was unassailable, that no other continent or kingdom could withstand the might of so many dragons. Another suggested that tampering with forging techniques in such radical ways might anger the gods of the 14 Flames. Superstition still thrived in Valyria, even if overshadowed by scholarly cunning. Gaiman felt a tightening in his chest, as if the atmosphere was too dense. The heat, the swirling illusions, the boisterous talk of conquest. It all made him yearn for clean air, for open skies. Seizing a lull in conversation, he slipped away from the banquet hall and ventured onto a terrace that overlooked the city. He leaned against the balustrade, inhaling the cooler night breeze. The stars shimmered overhead, scarcely visible against the glow from the lit towers. He thought again of Westeros, of a sky perhaps darker and clearer, free of the constant haze of magic and flame. A voice spoke from behind him. Alanis had followed, wearing a knowing look. She teased him gently about his tendency to slip away from gatherings. Gaiman laughed softly, admitting he needed a respite from the crush. They stood side by side, looking out over Valyria. Alanis murmured that she too sometimes wondered what lay beyond the city's bright borders, but they were Targaryens. Duty bound them here. She traced a finger along the stone balustrade and sighed. Maybe, she suggested, the city's labyrinthine wonders would be enough for them. Gaiman struggled to form an answer. Perhaps in some realm of fancy, they might uproot themselves and set off for the horizon. But the ties of family, tradition, and safety were strong cords. The monarchy of Westeros, the lords who squabbled amongst themselves, the high seats of Winterfell, Casterly Rock, Highgarden. They might remain forever a distant curiosity, glimpsed only in old tomes and second-hand accounts. They rejoined the gathering before their absence was noted. The remainder of the night passed in a haze of performances, toasts, and exchange of gifts. House Magier had staged a triumphant display, leaving the lesser houses duly impressed or envious? Orien spoke quietly with Gaiman near the end, hinting that forging an alliance with the Major might propel Targaryen fortunes to a new threshold. It could mean a more prominent role in the freehold. Gaiman answered with dutiful acceptance, though a quiet turmoil roiled within. Back at the Targaryen compound, Gaiman couldn't sleep. He paced his chamber, recalling every detail of the forging demonstration, the feasts, the quiet words exchanged on the terrace. For a moment, he stared at his reflection in the polished silver mirror. A young Valyrian lordling, silver-haired and bright-eyed, expected to continue the Targaryen line in the city of Dragonlords. But the reflection seemed distant, as if belonging to someone else entirely. Days passed, and the success of House Maegor's forging drew even more notice. Gifts arrived at Targaryen gates from those who wished to earn favor, costly trinkets, small tokens of esteem. Orien's relief was palpable. Their house might finally emerge from the middle echelons of Valyrian society. Yet this sudden interest also drew watchers, families who suspected the Targaryens of harboring ambitions. Invitations to private feasts and hunts trickled in. Gaiman found himself obligated to attend more gatherings, forging connections he had never before sought. One evening, as he returned from yet another social affair, he found a solitary figure waiting in the courtyard. By the light of the braziers, he recognized Alanis, her face set in an expression of concern. She revealed that rumors suggested House Valyrian was stirring trouble, that they resented the spotlight shifting elsewhere. The forging demonstration had overshadowed their own long-standing position in the city. Alanis suspected that House Targaryen might be caught in the crossfire if Valyrian decided to undermine Maegor. Gaiman felt a spike of apprehension. The idea of a full-blown conflict among Valyria's families was too grim to contemplate, yet not entirely improbable. Power struggles in the freehold could erupt with lethal consequences, dragging unwary houses into ruin. He half expected his father to dismiss these rumors. But Orien, when informed, responded with a solemn nod, warning Gaiman to keep watch for subtle slights or insults at future events. They had to navigate carefully. In the swirl of these developments, Gaiman found his desire to escape mounting. Duty pressed upon him, but the illusions of Valyria felt increasingly stifling. He sneaked away to read accounts of foreign shores whenever he could, as if searching for some secret path out of his predicament. Westeros beckoned him with its lords and ladies who owed no fealty to Valyria, who did not revolve in a dance of forging demonstrations and arcane feuds. He pictured northern snows drifting quietly over a castle, or the wide fields of the Reach rippling under a gentle sun, unperturbed by the fiery politics of the Dragonlords. Still, the notion of leaving was madness. His father would never consent, not with alliances at stake. Gaiman wondered if the old story that House Targaryen once considered fleeing Valyria might be repeated. Yet this time, none among them seemed inclined to run. The city was too grand, its power too alluring, and the safety of the known was a potent anchor. So Gaiman persevered, going through the motions of a young lord, all the while tasting the bitter tang of dissatisfaction. A few nights later, an autumn storm rolled in. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the city's spires in momentary flashes. Thunder rattled the window panes. Rain lashed the rooftops, hissing off the hot vents that lined the many towers. Gaiman awoke to the tumult, rising from bed to press his palm against the window's cool glass. In one bright flash, he glimpsed a massive dragon, silhouetted against the clouds, its roar lost in the thunder. Another flicker, and it vanished. In the silence between thunderclaps, he thought of what it meant to live among these wonders. The storms above Valyria were said to be shaped by spells lingering in the atmosphere, the land itself half-wrought by magic. Each day brought fresh marvels, but the city also thrummed with intrigue, and the weight of the family's ambition never ceased. Was he merely naive to imagine that other lands might be different, simpler? When the storm abated, he draped a cloak over his shoulders and hurried to the mews. Rain dripped from the stone steps, forming rivulets in the torchlit corridors. He found Valyria stirring, restless from the tempest. His dragon eyes glinted in the wavering light. Gaiman quietly stroked her scales. The storm's passing left a hush in its wake, and all he heard was his own breathing, the steady exhalation of the dragon's breath, and distant thunder receding. He stood there for a long time, lost in the rhythmic rise and fall of Zalyrax's flanks, imagining what it would feel like to sail on the open sea, to chart a course free from Valyria's labyrinthine demands. The wind rattled the high windows, cold air settling across the stone floor. Gaiman decided, in that moment, that someday he would find a way beyond the city's horizon. If only to see with his own eyes what the rest of the world was like. Yet for now, all he could do was wait, abide by his father's guidance, and tread carefully through the web of alliances. In the following weeks, the forging demonstrations' aftershocks continued to ripple through Valyria. Lords vied for the major technique, though the major kept their secrets guarded. Rumors that House Targaryens had begun forging alliances of their own circulated with more vigor. Gaiman noticed a growing tension beneath Valyria's polished surface. Polite conversations masked suspicion. A laugh at a feast might be a prelude to betrayal. This city, once the seat of unstoppable might, felt like a stage set for conflict. Orien imparted wisdom to his son at every turn, reminding him of loyalty to the freehold, urging him to keep House Targaryen above petty quarrels. Gaiman obeyed in outward show, but his heart remained captive to daydreams of flight. He kept these thoughts to himself, confiding only in Alanis, who cautioned him that if he ever tried to leave, the city might see it as desertion. The Targaryen name would not protect him if more powerful families accused them of disloyalty. The more complicated matters became, the more Gaiman felt the confines of his golden cage. Dragons soared overhead, and the city glowed with sorcery, but the stifling feeling of inevitability pressed him down. Each day, he attended to duty, training, courtesy calls, social affairs, and each night he looked through his books, searching for something intangible. The knowledge that Westeros remained unconquered, undisturbed by Valyrian rule, called to him. Perhaps it was only the allure of the unknown that tempted him. Or perhaps, deep inside, he believed that discovering lands untouched by the freehold would grant him a taste of genuine freedom. Still, the city and the family demanded his presence, and so his daily life continued as before. He might have gone on like that for months, perhaps even years, without taking a decisive step. Yet whispers grew in Valyria's corridors. Whispers of unrest, of old feuds awakened, of new forging techniques upsetting the balance of power. And perhaps, in the forging fires lit by House Major, a new flame had been kindled in Gaiman's own breast, fueling a restlessness that refused to dim. What if the Targaryens had left Valyria once upon a time, as that old rumor suggested, to avoid doom or perhaps seek new dominion in far-off lands? They had not, and here they stood, safe but stifled in a city that might, in its own hubris, overshadow all else. Some nights, Gaiman dreamed of the city crumbling under the weight of its own ambitions, the sky black with dragon wings, and he awoke in sweat, heart pounding. Then he would glance around his modest chamber, reassured by its solidity, and bury the dread under routine. The day came when Orien informed him that House Targaryen would host a small feast of their own, an event aimed at reinforcing ties with allied houses and demonstrating solidarity with the freehold's objectives. Preparations began at once, and Gaiman was tasked with organizing certain aspects. Arranging the courtyard, selecting music, ensuring that Zalyrax could be displayed in a safe but impressive manner. He saw the strain in his father's eyes, the desire to present the best face of House Targaryen without overreaching. So he threw himself into the tasks, burying his restlessness in the details of planning. Yet as he oversaw servants draping banners and polishing silver, Gaiman felt a pang of emptiness. Were these the summits of his life? Another feast, another demonstration, another performance of Valyrian prestige. Outside these walls, an entire world breathed, unconquered, uncharted, and he was stuck among illusions and courtiers. In an idle moment, he stepped away from the bustle, wandering through a secluded corridor with high windows. Looking down, he saw the sprawl of Valyria, the labyrinth of architecture that had grown and reshaped itself over centuries. Dragons soared lazily above, guardians and symbols of the freehold's power. He wondered if the Targaryens would remain here forever, just another house among many, overshadowed by mightier families, yet still chained by the collective pride of Valyria. Would the name Targaryen remain a footnote in the annals of the freehold, a lesser line with a handful of dragons and a modest estate? Gaiman's hand tightened on the windowsill. He thought of Westeros, the Seven Kingdoms, with their own quarrels, but also with the potential for something new, something that was not measured in the arcs of dragonflame or the forging of runes. At the end of that corridor, Gaiman found a door leading to an outside terrace, one seldom used. The wind carried a cool tang of approaching evening. He stepped out, bracing his hands on the worn stone railing, letting the breeze tussle his silver hair. There, in the golden light of sunset, Valyria spread before him in all its glory. Towers upon towers, brilliant and decadent, shimmering under the last rays of sun. The air was alive with distant roars of dragons, the hum of arcane energies, and the everlasting murmur of thousands of citizens going about their business. He closed his eyes, listening. He could almost hear the waves of the narrow sea, feel the pulse of foreign shores, sense the quiet rustle of trees in the forests of the west. It was all imagination, but it felt more tangible than any illusion conjured at a Valyrian feast. Then softly he murmured a promise to himself, barely audible against the wind, that one day he would see those realms with his own eyes, taste their air, and discover a fate beyond the glimmer of Valyria's horizon. The wind carried his words away. He knew not if they would ever come true, but the seed of longing that had taken root in him refused to die, even as he pulled himself back into the reality of the city's demands. For now, House Targaryen stood firmly in Valyria's heart, unwilling or unable to break free. Yet the soul of one young heir had begun to strain against its gilded cage, guided by the faint promise of lands undreamed of and tales yet unwritten. A.K. Night settled over the Targaryen compound like a velvet drape studded with faint stars, the moon obscured by drifting clouds that glowed faintly from the city's ever-present lights. In the darkness, torches flickered in the courtyard, reflecting off the black stone walls until every shadow seemed edged with dancing gold. Despite the late hour, Gaiman found no rest. His mind wandered back to the vision from the terrace, the glimmering sprawl of Valyria, beautiful and terrible, a place where destiny and doom might wear the same face. He made his way toward the stables at the edge of the compound, where lesser mounts and beasts were kept for short journeys into the farmland around the city. A sullen stable boy blinked in surprise at seeing him so late, but Gaiman offered a soft greeting, then asked if any errands needed doing. The boy shook his head, mutely setting down a pail of water. Gaiman inhaled the warm, pungent air of the stable, hay, manure, and the earthy smell of livestock. It was such a stark contrast to the perfumed corridors within the main estate that it jolted him awake. Here, there were no illusions, no arcs of runes shining in the air, only the realness of mud and living creatures. He stayed for a time, stroking the muzzle of a docile mare used to carry goods. The horse leaned into his hand, seeking comfort. The stable boy explained how the mare had been restless, uneasy around the dragon's roars. Gaiman nodded, murmuring that many creatures found Valyria's symphony of wing beats and flame unnerving. He listened to the soft shuffle of hooves, the water dripping from the pail, the distant rumble of night traffic passing through the streets beyond the high compound walls. It felt oddly peaceful, and part of him wished he could remain in that hush. But responsibilities called, even if they wouldn't surface until morning. At length, he returned to his chamber, falling into a fitful sleep. Dreams haunted him. He saw a shore thick with dark pebbles, battered by a cold sea, and overhead soared a single dragon, its cry lost in the wind. Then the vision changed, replaced by the labyrinthine spires of Valyria trembling under a red sky. Faces blurred in and out of focus. Alanis, Orion, Othar Balares. And he woke just before dawn, heart pounding. He dressed in silence, pulling on a simple tunic, before venturing up to the mews to greet Zelyrax. The dragon was curled in the corner of her enclosure, half awake. At the sight of him, she let out a faint rumble of greeting, her eyes glimmering with watery reflections of the rising sun. He spent the morning in routine tasks, guiding the stable hands and keepers who fed and groomed the dragons. Orien was nowhere to be seen. He typically rose later on days when no urgent business demanded his attention, content to let the household run under watchful stewards. Gaiman found Alanis in the library annex, perched at a high stool behind a dusty lectern, studying a scroll. She acknowledged him with a quick smile, then turned back to the text, speaking as she read. She described a new rumor drifting through the city. House Major planned to hold further demonstrations of their forging method, but only to certain select families, and the Targaryens might not receive an immediate invitation. This might be the Major's way of increasing their leverage, ensuring only those who truly sought to form alliances would be granted deeper insight. Alanis pursed her lips, suggesting that Orien would likely navigate the matter carefully. House Targaryen couldn't afford to appear snubbed, yet neither could they beg. Gaiman nodded, absorbing it all. Politics, as ever, was a dance on a razor's edge. One misstep, and a family could bleed out before the city's watchful eyes. In the late morning, Gaiman practiced swordsmanship with Aethon in the courtyard. Aethon pushed him to refine his stance, to meld fluid movements with precision. They talked in short bursts, between the clang of steel. Aethon cautioned that tensions in the city felt like a blade close to shattering. If House Valyrian or others were stirring trouble, then perhaps House Targaryen should keep its head low. Gaiman recognized the subtext. Avoid unnecessary conflicts. Let the storms pass. But each time he parried Aethon's blade, he felt a streak of frustration. House Targaryen always stood at the periphery. There was a sense of security in that, but also suffocation. At midday, Orien convened a gathering in the solar to discuss the forthcoming feast. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, bathing the blackstone and the dragon-carved furniture in a balmy glow. A spread of fresh fruit and spiced wine sat on a small table for refreshment. Alanis was present, along with several key stewards, while Gaiman listened from his father's right side. Orien appeared calm but determined, outlining the logistics. The meal would be served in the open-air courtyard, with tapestries depicting Targaryen dragons on proud display. Entertainment would include music, illusions, and perhaps a short flight demonstration if the conditions allowed. The guest list included a handful of smaller houses allied with Targaryen interests, as well as a few from higher up who might show courtesy, Major among them, if possible. A steward named Ivaris began listing concerns. Certain suppliers had raised prices, claiming their goods were in high demand due to the swirl of festivities across the city. Then there was the issue of ensuring enough space for dragons, given that many families preferred to arrive mounted. Orien offered calm solutions, instructing them to pay a fair rate for the best supplies, focusing on quality rather than lavish excess, and to prepare one of the outer courtyards for visiting dragons. He also stressed that the Targaryen household would maintain a modest yet dignified environment. No reason to rival the extravagance of the oldest families. As they planned, Gaiman found his thoughts wandering. He imagined foreign feasts in the far-flung courts of Westeros, wondering if they were simpler or just as entangled in local rivalry. He closed his eyes briefly, hearing the hum of voices around him, a swirl of obligations in this vast city of fire and might. The meeting concluded when Orien gave final instructions, and the group dispersed to handle details. Gaiman lingered a moment. His father signaled him to stay, and Alanis tactfully left them alone. Orien leaned against a table, arms folded. He regarded his son with an expression that blended fatherly warmth and firm resolve. He acknowledged Gaiman's restlessness, remarking that he had noticed the way Gaiman gazed out windows or listened so intently to travelers' tales. Orien's voice was gentle, but edged with concern. Perhaps, he suggested, Gaiman should accompany him on an upcoming trip to the southern frontier of the Freehold, where Valyrian authority blended into the lands of Old Keys and Slaver's Bay. It was not Westeros, but it was still a journey beyond the usual city boundaries, a taste of the world outside these spires. Gaiman felt his chest tighten, an unexpected flicker of hope. Even if it meant traveling under the official banner of House Targaryen, it was still travel. He bowed his head, thanking his father for the offer. Orien cautioned that the expedition was not guaranteed. Much depended on the next few weeks, on how the feast unfolded, how alliances shifted. For now, focus on your duties, Orion said, reminding Gaiman that it was crucial to present the best face of House Targaryen at the upcoming gathering. Gaiman agreed, heart thrumming with both gratitude and a longing for more than a small step. The afternoon slipped by in a flurry of preparations. Gaiman inspected the courtyard where the feast would be held. The pillars were freshly scrubbed, the mosaic tiles swept, and flags bearing the Targaryen sigil were hung along the edges. He consulted with the house seamstress about attire, ensuring that his own garments matched the understated elegance his father desired. Then he oversaw the servant staff, checking the layout of tables, the angles of braziers and lanterns. As the day waned, Alanis approached with a grin, teasing that Gaiman was fussing like an old caretaker. He merely shrugged, anxious for everything to be in place. During a short lull, the two of them slipped into a quiet corner of the compound's gardens. Narrow paths wound through shrubs of fiery red blossoms, cultivated by the Targaryen horticulturists. A small fountain trickled, carved in the likeness of a dragon's head spouting water from its mouth. They sat on a low stone bench. Alanis remarked that the city had grown uneasy in recent days. She had received a coded message from an acquaintance in House Valyrian, suggesting that Valyrian was forging pacts with some of the older families, stoking fears that the new forging technique might upset the city's equilibrium. Gaiman shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. The forging demonstration had been meant to showcase Valyria's brilliance, but it seemed to have roused old jealousies. Alanis noted that, at least for now, the trouble remained rumors and undercurrents, not open hostilities. But these tensions could reflect badly on any lesser house that stumbled into the crossfire. Gaiman caught the hint. Targaryen might do well to keep close to friendly houses, but also to avoid entangling themselves in the direct line of conflict. They sat a while, letting the garden's quiet soothe them. The faint aroma of blossoms mingled with the ever-present tang of sulfur from the city's deeper vents. Dragons occasionally soared overhead, their shadows crossing the ground. Alanis confessed that she worried for Gaiman. She sensed his longing to see more of the world and recognized how it clashed with his obligations here. Gently, she pointed out that their ancestor, who had once considered leaving Valyria, had been ridiculed by some for showing timidity, while others praised them for foresight. Either way, House Targaryen had stayed. The results were plain to see. Gaiman reached for her hand and squeezed it in a gesture of thanks, though he said nothing. A hush settled over them. At length, they rose to continue the day's tasks, once more donning the faces of dutiful Targaryens in the city of flame and shadow. As evening approached, the compound glowed with the light of newly lit lanterns. In one corner of the courtyard, a pair of traveling musicians rehearsed for the feast, plucking at stringed instruments that produced a soulful melody with an exotic twist. Gaiman paused to listen, tapping his foot in time. The tune was unlike typical Valyrian airs. He learned they hailed from Qarth, a city beyond the Red Waste, where caravans carried silken spices in winding trade routes. Their music evoked distant deserts and star-strewn nights, conjuring images of caravans beneath foreign skies. Gaiman thanked them for the performance, requesting that they play similarly haunting tunes when the feast began. He turned to find Miria Maegir stepping into the courtyard, accompanied by two other young retainers of her house. Gaiman started. He hadn't expected her arrival this soon, especially not unannounced. Miria wore a high-collared dress in deep crimson, embroidered with subtle gold thread. She greeted Gaiman with a mischievous smile, explaining that she had come ahead of the official invitation, eager to see the preparations and ensure she had time to speak with him privately. Her companions took in the surroundings with cool stares. Gaiman offered a polite bow, quickly dispatching a servant to alert Orion. He escorted Miria to a corner of the courtyard where lanterns were being tested. She commended the Targaryens for their sense of style, praising the banners and subtlety. With a laugh, she confessed that House Maegir sometimes veered into the ostentatious. This candor charmed Gaiman. He led her through the garden paths, showing her the fountain and the carefully cultivated red blossoms. As they walked, she took his arm, speaking softly about the forging demonstration. She confided that her family was wary of angering other powerful houses. They'd never meant to create strife, only to showcase their skill. Now though, House Major felt the chill of potential backlash. Gaiman understood. Valyria's attention could be as destructive as a dragon's flame when it turned hostile. She then turned the conversation toward dragons themselves, teasing Gaiman about Zelirax. Miria wanted to see the she-dragon. Gaiman hesitated. Zelirax was in her roost, likely half asleep. Still, he agreed, unable to resist her pleading expression. They made their way inside, climbing the wide spiral steps to the upper mews. The corridors were dark at this hour, torchlight casting wavering shadows on the walls. Miria clung to Gaiman's arm, half for support and half out of genuine anticipation. The roost was quiet, save for the low rasp of a stable hand, who dozed on a bench near the entrance. Zelirax lay curled upon a stone platform scattered with straw. At their approach, the dragon uncoiled, rising to her full but relatively modest height. Miria gasped, stepping forward with fascination shining in her eyes. Zelirax regarded her warily. Gaiman placed a gentle hand on the dragon's flank, murmuring reassurance. Miria extended her hand to let Zelirax catch her scent. The dragon sniffed, exhaling a warm gust that lifted a few strands of Miria's hair. She laughed, delighted. She praised Zelirax's coloration, the silver-blue scales that gleamed like polished metal. Gaiman felt a flush of pride as Miria asked about the dragon's temperament, her flight patterns, her growth. He answered eagerly, forgetting the day's cares in the simple pleasure of sharing something beloved. Eventually, they returned to the courtyard, where Orion waited with measured politeness. He welcomed Miria, though his gaze held a slight wariness. Such an informal visit was unusual. Miria offered her father's regards, stating she came to see how the arrangements fared, and to assure House Targaryen that Maegir had no intention of overshadowing them at this gathering. Orion accepted her reassurances with a diplomatic smile, extending his own invitation to the upcoming feast. Gaiman noticed a subtle tension in his father's posture, as though uncertain what angle House Maegir might be working now. Miria took her leave soon after, promising she would return with her family on the official feast day. Gaiman escorted her and her companions to the gate, bidding them farewell with a courteous bow. After they departed, he lingered by the gate, thoughts spinning. For all the political maneuvering that might be at play, Miria seemed genuinely friendly, or perhaps she was skilled at appearing so. He couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility that her warmth had a purpose. This was Valyria, after all, where every smile might conceal a calculation. The following day, Gaiman woke before dawn and ventured into the skies on Zelirax. He guided her over the city walls, letting the crisp air stream over them. From a dragon's vantage, the farmland beyond Valyria was a tranquil patchwork of fields, dotted with small villages and roving herds. He caught glimpses of farmers tending early crops, the pale shape of sheep scattering at the sound of flapping wings. After a wide, lazy circuit, he returned before the city fully stirred. Feeling both exhilarated and weighed down, the flight renewed his longing to see more than Valyria's immediate hinterlands. Down below, the swirl of daily life continued in the city's winding avenues. Steam from forges mingled with the morning light, and hawkers called out wares in a dozen tongues. Slaves and freemen, magisters and crafters, all mingled in a tapestry of commerce. At the Targaryen compound, final touches were being placed on the feast preparations. The courtyard's pillars were adorned with fresh garlands of fire lilies, their blossoms a vibrant orange streaked with red. Cooks labored in the kitchens, preparing fragrant roasts, platters of spiced vegetables, and sweet pastries shaped like tiny dragons. As the day advanced, guests began to arrive in small groups, each heralded by the watchman at the gate. Most were lesser houses with whom Targaryen had long-standing relationships, families that raised minor dragons or engaged in modest trade. They arrived on horseback or in small litters, respectfully acknowledging the Targaryen banners. Gaiman greeted them with courtesy, guiding them into the courtyard where attendants offered refreshments. The air buzzed with polite chatter. A late afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the black stone, and gradually, more prestigious arrivals trickled in. A pair of proud lords from House Valyrian, recognized by their seahorse sigil embroidered in silver, approached astride lean dragons. They folded their wings in the courtyard, sending gusts of wind that made the smaller houses step back in awe. Orion greeted them personally, ensuring that their dragons were guided to an appropriate roosting space. Gaiman noticed a certain tension in the Valyrians' demeanor, as though they too were wary of the subtle changes in Valyria's power game. House Magyar arrived soon after, though not in its full grandeur. Lord Sarian and Lady Rialta rode a pair of sleek, pale-scaled dragons, while Maria and another younger cousin arrived in a chariot drawn by draconic creatures that were more ornamental than functional. Servants rushed to assist them, and Gaiman noticed that Maria wore a subdued gown of charcoal gray shot through with subtle gold threads, not quite the flamboyant red he'd seen her in previously. The entire family exuded an air of studied graciousness, as if mindful of not overshadowing their hosts. As twilight fell, the feast formally began. Tables arranged in a semicircle filled the courtyard, lit by torches and lanterns that flickered with arcane flames of varying hues, some green, some blue, all adding to the atmosphere of otherworldly spectacle. Musicians plucked their strings, weaving notes that echoed off the carved pillars. Servants moved through the gathering, pouring wine, offering plates of spiced meats and freshly baked bread. Gaiman circulated among the guests, mindful of his father's instructions to charm without pretense. In a corner near a marble statue of the Targaryen founder, Gaiman found Miria speaking quietly with Alanis. He approached, catching the tail end of their conversation, something about a rumored voyage to Sothorios that a few bold explorers were planning. Miria seemed intrigued by the notion of uncharted jungles and hidden wealth, while Alanis cautioned that few who ventured into those wild southern lands return. They greeted Gaiman warmly, and he joined in, discussing the broader world in terms that made his heart race. He could almost forget the stiff constraints of Valyria as they chatted about faraway seas, desert caravans, and forgotten isles. Near to the head table, Orion presided with a calm, genial manner, hosting the Valyrians, Magyars, and several other minor lords. A delicate dance of words unfolded, with references to forging, alliances, and the complexities of trade. Everyone kept their tone polite, deflecting deeper tension behind pleasantries. At one point, Rialta Magyar complimented the subtlety of the Targaryen event, praising Orion's ability to create an intimate gathering without sacrificing dignity. Orion thanked her, acknowledging he had no wish to compete with the largest houses in grandeur. He preferred sincerity over spectacle. With each passing course of the meal, the courtyard grew livelier. Conversations turned spirited. Wine loosened tongues. The traveling musicians launched into a bold piece, half lament and half celebration, which prompted a smattering of applause. In the midst of this, Gaiman noticed Othar Valyries slip into the feast. He had not been formally announced, and his presence put the servants on edge. Valyries was a name that carried weight and a degree of unease in the city, known for harsh dealings and an old, proud lineage. Othar wore dark, richly embroidered robes and carried himself with the swagger of someone who considered himself above lesser gatherings. His gaze flickered across the courtyard, assessing the Targaryen hospitality. Orion, ever the diplomat, rose to greet him, though there was a tightness around his eyes. Othar offered a brief bow, if it could be called that, then accepted a seat. The conversation at the head table took on a stilted air, with each participant treading carefully. Lord Sarian Magyar, in particular, seemed to watch Othar with guarded eyes, as though anticipating an attack in the guise of conversation. Gaiman, stationed across the courtyard, studied the scene with a mounting sense of unease. Alanis approached, whispering that Othar's appearance without prior notice was a statement in itself. He did not fear being unwelcome. In Valyria, such small gestures could be preludes to greater moves. Gaiman watched as Othar sampled the wine, made a show of praising its vintage, then steered the discussion toward forging techniques. Lady Rialta answered politely, but Othar pressed on, making veiled references to the city's new wave of experimentations. Tension spiraled. The music continued. Guests chattered among themselves, but an undercurrent of awareness rippled through the courtyard. Gaiman saw Orion's knuckles whiten on his goblet. Even Miria, so lively minutes before, had gone quiet, focusing on her plate to avoid Othar's gaze. Finally, a jester-like performer launched into a comedic routine near the center of the courtyard, drawing attention away from the table. Laughter erupted, and Othar's interrogation waned. Seizing the moment, Gaiman approached Miria and Alanis, inviting them to stroll among the guests, subtly changing the dynamic. They accepted. Making rounds, they offered pleasantries, admired one lady's dragon-bone necklace, complimented another lord's knowledge of horticulture. Gaiman did his best to project calm, if only to counter the heavy mood Othar's arrival had cast. Yet beneath his polite smile, he felt a coil of anxiety in his stomach. If House Valyrian was indeed forging alliances in opposition to Maegir, how might Targaryen remain neutral? Later in the evening, Orion stood and raised a toast. The courtyard hushed. He spoke of Valyria's legacy, praising the city's tradition of innovation, and acknowledging the role each house played in preserving the freehold's greatness. He thanked everyone for attending, reaffirming that House Targaryen held no ambitions beyond serving the city's larger goals. The speech was well received, polite applause echoing off stone. Yet Gaiman could not ignore the flicker in Othar's eyes. Something dark, a challenge perhaps. After Orion's toast, dessert was served. Pastries shaped like dragons' heads, drizzled in honey, accompanied by chilled fruit and sweet wines. The gloom receded somewhat. Laughter and conversation swelled again, though Gaiman noticed that several guests, including Othar, were exchanging meaningful glances as they sampled the sweets. It felt like every word carried a double meaning, each courtesy layered with subtext. Miria found Gaiman near the musician's corner and tugged at his sleeve, suggesting they step away for a moment. She led him to a secluded nook by one of the pillars, where the sounds of the feast were muffled by the stone. She spoke in hushed tones. Her father had bid her watch Othar carefully to see what his true intentions might be. She asked Gaiman if he understood the magnitude of the tension brewing. Valyrians had old ties, and any sign of weakness from Maegir could open a chasm in Valyrian politics. Miria worried that Targaryen, by hosting both families at the same event, might be forced to pick sides. Gaiman's breath caught. If that happened, his father would inevitably choose a path that preserved Targaryen survival. But the city's shifting alliances might not grant them an easy route. He told Miria he had no illusions about how precarious such a position was. Still, House Targaryen was hardly a threat to Valyrians or Maegir. They might manage to remain neutral. Miria looked unconvinced, pointing out that neutrality too was a choice in Valyria, one that could be held against them if the tide turned. Before he could respond, a mild commotion from the center of the courtyard drew their attention. One of the comedic performers had pulled Othar Valyrian into a playful routine, trying to coax laughter from him. Othar responded coldly, refusing to partake. An awkward silence spread, and the performer slunk away. Othar then rose, tossed a few coins onto the table with an almost scornful gesture, and announced that he had other matters to attend to. He left with the same swagger he'd arrived with, ignoring Orion's polite attempt to see him off. The hush that followed was palpable. Some guests exchanged uneasy murmurs, while others pretended not to notice. Orion summoned his composure, raising a final toast to the city's prosperity, trying to restore the feast's mood. Gaiman joined in, but the earlier warmth had vanished. Even the illusions performed by a hired sorcerer seemed subdued, as if the shadows they conjured were ominous rather than entertaining. When the last plates had been cleared and the final cups drained, the guests departed with polite farewells. Lady Rialta expressed her thanks to Orion, while Lord Sarion wore a tight smile, perhaps unsettled by Othar's abrupt exit. Miria squeezed Gaiman's hand in parting, her eyes flickering with apprehension. Then she followed her family into the night. The smaller houses left in clusters, many of them relieved that the evening had ended without open conflict. Lord Valyrian gave Orion a respectful nod, indicating that while Targaryen might not be central to the city's power, they had shown tact that would be remembered. Gaiman watched the last of the guests vanish into the darkness beyond the torchlit gates, their dragons a final flash of wings overhead. The courtyard, once so vibrant, now lay strewn with empty cups, crumpled napkins, and a few extinguished lanterns that sputtered in the mild breeze. Orion stood in the center of it all, a solitary figure in black and silver. The flicker of a still-burning torch cast wavering shadows on his face, revealing an exhaustion that had been well concealed before. Gaiman and Olenys approached, each uncertain what to say. Orien let out a weary sigh, acknowledging that the feast had been decent enough. No open fights, no insults unmasked. But also that Othar Belerius' presence loomed like a thundercloud over everything. Olenys delicately suggested that Targaryen move forward with caution, perhaps reaffirming their loyalty to the freehold in a public manner. Orien nodded, but a trace of frustration entered his voice. There was only so much they could do without looking desperate. He ordered the servants to begin cleanup and quietly dismissed them, after receiving their bowed acknowledgments. With just the three of them remaining, Orien allowed more candor to surface. He told Gaiman that the trip southward might need to be postponed. The uncertainties in the city were growing too large to leave the compound unprotected. They had to ensure House Targaryen remained vigilant, keep an eye on alliances, and avoid becoming entangled in a wider confrontation. Gaiman suppressed a pang of disappointment, though he understood. The world beyond Valyria would have to wait. That night, as the compound settled into an uneasy slumber, Gaiman sat alone in the upper balcony that overlooked the courtyard. A few servants bustled below, cleaning the last remnants of the feast. The air was thick with the smell of candle wax, spilled wine, and ash from the dragon braziers. Overhead, stars flickered between drifting clouds of smoke that rose from Valyria's countless chimneys and forges. Once again, he felt trapped, bound to a city that might be on the brink of crisis. He recalled Neria's warning, the swirl of tension between Maegir and Belares. He thought of the old rumor that Targaryen ancestors had nearly fled to the west, and how that might have been either cowardice or wisdom. He pictured a young drake cooped up in a cramped mews, longing for open skies. Perhaps that was what he was. An echo of Zalyrax, restless, wanting to stretch wings beyond the labyrinth of stone and flame. But duty held him fast. Morning brought a somber calm to the Targaryen estate. Gaiman woke before sunrise, descending to the courtyard where the detritus of the night's feast had already been swept away. Servants were busy scrubbing wine stains from the mosaic tiles and storing leftover provisions. A hush lingered, as though the place still recalled the charged atmosphere of the evening. Gaiman thanked the servants for their work, offering a kind word here and there. They smiled faintly, appreciating his attention. In the corridors, Olenys waited, holding a rolled parchment that bore the major sigil. She had discovered it, delivered by a messenger at dawn. Opening it, they found a brief note from Neria, penned in elegant script, thanking them for their hospitality and expressing hope that Targaryen would remain safe amid the city's shifting currents. The note was courteous but laced with concern. Gaiman read it twice, uncertain how to interpret her tone. Soon afterward, Orien called his son to a private audience in the solar. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, catching motes of dust in golden beams. The polished table where Orien sat glinted, revealing carved dragons along its edges. He gestured for Gaiman to sit, then began to speak in a low, steady voice. He recounted news that had reached him that very morning. A small uprising in a distant region of the Freehold, where a local warlord claimed Valyria's demands for tribute were unjust. While such revolts were common on the fringes, this one had garnered secret support from a faction within the city. No one knew which families might be involved, but rumors pointed to tensions among old lines. Orien suspected that, with the forging demonstration raising the stakes, certain houses might be backing rebellious movements far away, hoping to drain rivals' resources if forced to respond. House Valyrian, with its deep pockets and older alliances, was high on the list of potential agitators. Orien quietly admitted he feared Targaryen could be a target if they appeared too close to Major. It might serve someone's purpose to weaken both houses by forcing them into conflict or suspicion. Gaiman listened, feeling the weight of these revelations. The thought of uprisings and political sabotage in distant corners of the Freehold made his earlier daydreams of traveling abroad seem trivial. Here, in the city's heart, games of power could spark chaos that reached across continents. He asked his father how Targaryen should respond. Orien leaned back, the sunlight etching lines of worry on his face. They had to remain discreet, he said, reaffirming loyalty to the Freehold, without alienating Major. or appearing like an easy pawn for Valyrians. He instructed Gaiman to maintain friendly correspondence with Maria and her family. Not so close as to raise red flags, but enough to show Targaryen had no ill intentions. At the same time, Aurion would approach House Valyrian and other neutral families, ensuring them that Targaryen had no hunger for conflict. It was a balancing act, the kind that could break them if poorly executed. Gaiman agreed, though a part of him yearned for a simpler life, one without labyrinthine alliances. Over the next week, Gaiman and Alanis drafted letters, carefully worded notes that politely thanked Maegor for attending the feast, acknowledged the forging demonstrations, and offered well wishes without committing Targaryen to any stance. They sent similar letters to Valyrian and other allies, weaving a tapestry of courtesy that might protect them from suspicion. All the while, Gaiman's longing for a distant horizon did not fade. But each day he felt the cords of duty tighten. Despite the political tension, life in Valyria continued. The city's artisans hawked wares in the markets, minstrels wandered the streets singing of ancient conquests, and forges belched smoke into the sky. Dragons soared overhead, a routine wonder that never lost its power to awe. Each morning, Gaiman trained with Aethon, then tended to Zalyrax. Sometimes he spied Maria in the marketplace, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, but always from a distance. They exchanged quick, guarded smiles. The hush before a potential storm fell over the Targaryen compound. Aurion spent long hours in hushed meetings, conferring with allies and carefully selecting which families to invite for private dinners. Alanis read everything she could on Valyria's older feuds, hoping to glean insight. Gaiman assisted as best he could, but felt increasingly restless. Some nights, he dreamed of taking flight with Zalyrax, gliding over the narrow sea until Valyria's lights vanished behind the horizon. In the dream, he found green shores and rolling hills, empty of the city's ominous glow. Yet dawn always broke, dragging him back to the labyrinth of alliances and conspiracies. Then, on a morning when the sky was golden and clear, a messenger arrived at the gates, bearing the Valyrian sigil. The guard who admitted him seemed nervous. Gaiman, summoned to receive the message, accepted a sealed scroll. Opening it, he found a missive from Othar Valyrius himself, written in a stiff, formal hand. It congratulated House Targaryen on their recent feast, and requested a private meeting with Aurion to discuss the forging demonstration, and to ensure mutual understanding between their houses. The letter ended with an almost polite threat. In uncertain times, families who shared common interests should stand together, lest they be swept away by the city's shifting sands. Gaiman felt a chill. Othar's overture made it clear that Valyrians intended to gauge Targaryen loyalties. Perhaps he wished to coerce them into distancing themselves from Maegor. If Aurion refused, it could be seen as a slight. If he agreed, it risked incurring Maegor's suspicion. And so the net tightened. Gaiman brought the message to Aurion, who read it in silence, jaw set. A glance at his father's face told Gaiman that House Targaryen stood at a fork in the road. Either path might lead to trouble. That same day, Aurion summoned his chief advisors, along with Alanis and Gaiman, to deliberate. They gathered in the solar behind closed doors. The oldest steward advised caution, suggesting Aurion meet Othar, but avoid any commitments. Another advisor worried that even a meeting might imply support for Valyrians, straining relations with Maegor. Alanis noted that turning down the request could be interpreted as an insult, which in Valyria's culture was not easily forgiven. Gaiman, asked for his perspective, admitted that for survival, Targaryen might need to at least hear Othar out. Aurion listened, fingers steepled, deep lines of concentration on his brow. By dusk, he decided to accept the invitation for a parley, to be held discreetly in a neutral location, perhaps at a small estate outside the city's main sprawl, ensuring neither side gained advantage by hosting. A letter of reply was composed, stating that Lord Aurion Targaryen would come alone, accompanied by a minimal escort, hoping to foster trust. The text was careful, polished, showing willingness to converse without subservience. Gaiman helped finalize the phrasing, feeling an odd mix of dread and relief. At least they were doing something concrete, though who knew if it was the right choice. In the days that followed, Final arrangements were made. A date was set for the meeting, a location chosen at an old hunting lodge, belonging to a minor family that had no strong ties to either Targaryen or Valyrians. Oberyn insisted Gaiman remain in the city for safety, a decision Gaiman did not contest. He dreaded the possibility that this parley might erupt into violence, but he was powerless to stop it. On the morning of Oberyn's departure, Gaiman rose early to see him off. Caraxes, Oberyn's older drake, stood waiting in the courtyard, wings half furled. Oberyn wore plain riding leathers, eschewing more formal attire to emphasize the meeting's private nature. Gaiman clasped his father's hand, searching Oberyn's eyes for any sign of fear. The older man smiled, though it was a weary smile, and told Gaiman that everything would be fine. Then, Oberyn climbed onto Caraxes, and with a few heavy beats of the dragon's wings, they soared into the pale sky. Gaiman watched them fade into the distance, a sharp ache in his chest. Back inside the compound, a hush seemed to blanket everything. Alanis touched Gaiman's arm, encouraging him to be patient, to trust Oberyn's skill at negotiation. Gaiman nodded, but pacing the corridors, he felt each hour stretch unbearably long. He attempted to distract himself by organizing the library annex, reading old records of treaties between houses, scanning genealogies to see how Targaryen might connect to Valyrians. He found little comfort there, only a reminder that these families' roots ran deep, entangled in centuries of shared triumphs and betrayals. Night came without word. The household lit braziers, and Gaiman climbed to the tower top where he watched the city. Great beams of arcane light flickered occasionally, marking some distant ritual or spectacle. Dragons soared as silhouettes against the moon, returning to their roosts. He waited, feeling each breath grow heavy. Would Oberyn return safely, or would House Valyrians strike? He cursed his own impotence, wishing he could leap onto Xylarax and find his father, but that would breach the terms of the meeting. The hours bled into darkness. Finally, near midnight, the watchman announced a single dragon approaching the estate. Gaiman rushed down to the courtyard, heart hammering. The shape resolved into Caraxes, descending in a swirl of wind and dust. Oberyn dismounted, aided by 2 Targaryen guards. Gaiman saw his father's face pale as milk, the lines of anxiety etched starkly. Oberyn offered a faint nod, signaling he was unharmed but deeply unsettled. With a terse order, he dismissed the guards, and beckoned Gaiman and Alanis to the solar. There, by the light of a single brazier, Oberyn recounted the meeting. Other Valyrians had welcomed him with outward courtesy, yet the conversation swiftly turned ominous. Other accused Major of meddling in forging techniques that threatened the freehold's delicate balance of power. He pressed Oberyn to join forces, covertly or overtly, to ensure that House Major's ambitions did not endanger Valyria. Oberyn's refusals to commit had been met with veiled threats. The outcome was unsettling. Oberyn had neither allied with Valyrians nor declared opposition, a stance that might placate no one. Gaiman listened, fists clenched, as his father described the final moments of the parley. Othar hinted that other houses would soon stand with Valyrians. If Targaryen did not choose a side, it might be swept away. Oberyn had responded that House Targaryen served the freehold above all, refusing to be manipulated. In the end, they parted in an uneasy truce. Oberyn's voice trembled slightly as he admitted he feared retribution. Alanis placed a reassuring hand on Oberyn's shoulder. Gaiman inhaled slowly, thoughts racing. This was more serious than a simple rivalry. Valyria sought to corner Targaryen into a broader conflict. If Othar aligned enough families against Major, or vice versa, war within the freehold might ignite. And even if it never reached open bloodshed, the political fallout could be devastating. Yet the Targaryens had stood firm. They had not yielded to intimidation. A measure of pride flared in Gaiman, tempered by the cold realization that House Targaryen was little more than a cork, adrift in a raging sea. What if the rift widened, engulfing them all? He mulled the idea that some Targaryen ancestors had once glimpsed this fate, contemplating flight to the west to escape Valyria's eventual doom, only to remain here. Would that decision be their family's final legacy? Tension clung to the estate in the following days. Whispers among the servants suggested some might be fearful of sabotage. A few swore they had spotted strange figures lurking near the outer walls at night. Though no trace was found, Orien fortified the household guard, discreetly instructing them to watch for any sign of infiltration. Alani spent late hours in the library, searching for references to past conflicts that might parallel the current crisis. Gaiman played his role, meeting with lesser lords, exchanging small courtesies to keep channels open, all while a quiet dread gnawed at him. One evening, a coded message arrived from House Mahir, presumably from Miria or her father, requesting a secret meeting with Targaryen representatives to discuss the outcome of Orien's parley. Gaiman burned with curiosity. He wanted to see Miria again, to hear their side of matters. But Orien hesitated, concerned about provoking Valyrians further if word got out. Alani suggested a careful approach, a single envoy traveling by night. Orien would not go himself, not after the strain of the last meeting. Gaiman volunteered, pulse quickening. And so, in the hush of a moonless night, Gaiman prepared to slip beyond Targaryen gates, wearing a plain cloak over simple clothing, determined to discover what House Major truly wanted, and to find some thread of hope in this tangled web. As he mounted Zelirax, heart pounding, he cast one final glance at the Targaryen compound. The walls loomed black against the sky, silent and watchful, shelter and cage both. Then, with a snap of the reins, he guided the dragon upward. He did not know where this path would lead, only that his house stood in precarious balance between powers too great to ignore. Yet he felt the flutter of exhilaration. For all the tension, this was movement, an escape, however brief, from the stifling weight of destiny. Zelirax roared softly, wings beating in the cool air, and together they vanished into Valyria's nocturnal shadows, seeking answers in a city that never truly slept. Aikani Enda. Zelirax soared over the sleeping city, her leathery wings beating a steady rhythm against the dark sky. Beneath Gaiman's cloak, the rush of cool air prickled his skin, and his senses were heightened by the secrecy of his mission. He had set out an hour past midnight, leaving through a small postern gate that few in the household used, ensuring minimal attention from the guards. Even so, he felt their eyes on him as he took to the air, watchmen in the towers peering through the gloom. He was careful to keep Zelirax's roar subdued, guiding her into a wide arc that avoided Valyria's more crowded districts. He carried with him 2 sealed letters, one carefully prepared by Orien, the other written in Alani's neat script, each addressed to House Major in slightly different tones of courtesy and reassurance. Gaiman himself wore no armor, only plain black riding leathers beneath a hooded cloak. The letters were tucked in a pouch at his side, close to his body, where he could feel their weight with each shift of the dragon's flight. The night sky was moonless, a boon for stealth. Distant pinpoints of stars glimmered behind wisps of cloud. Below, the city's lights wove a tapestry of flickering orange and green, torches and arcane flares mingling with the faint glow from the ever-active forges. As they flew beyond the central spires, the structures began to thin, giving way to less developed regions where farmland stretched toward the horizon. In the distance rose the jagged silhouettes of dormant volcanoes, reminders of the power that had birthed Valyria's empire. Here, the roads were narrower, the estates more isolated. Gaiman had memorized the directions from a coded note in Maria's message, a discreet orchard belonging to a minor ally of House Major. Supposedly, a small clearing at its center would serve as the meeting place. He guided Zelirax lower, scanning for landmarks. A tall row of cypress-like trees, a stone well near a footpath. The orchard appeared as a block of dark shapes, a few torches glimmering near a storage shed. Zelirax landed gently in a clearing flanked by twisted fruit trees, their branches heavy with pale, luminous blossoms that reflected the faint starlight. Gaiman dismounted, his boots sinking into soft earth. At once he sensed a hush in the air, as if the orchard itself held its breath. He waited, hand resting on Zelirax's flank. The dragon snorted quietly, her eyes reflecting the torchlight in golden sparks. Eventually, a figure emerged from the shadows, lantern in hand, face concealed behind a cloth half-mask. Gaiman stood alert, though he kept one hand raised, a gesture signaling no threat. The figure inclined their head and motioned for him to follow deeper into the orchard. He led Valyrax a short distance, passing rows of trees that rustled faintly in the breeze, their blossoms perfuming the darkness with a delicate floral tang. They reached a small circle of clearing, where 2 more lanterns hung from low branches, forming a shallow pool of light. 2 shapes stood beneath the largest tree. Gaiman recognized Miria's outline. Slender, with a certain poised confidence. Beside her was a broader figure, cloaked in green. In the half-light, Gaiman glimpsed his face, realizing it was Lord Sarian Magyar, Miria's father. Gaiman's heart pounded. He had not expected the head of House Magyar himself, though in retrospect, it made sense if the matter was as urgent as the note suggested. Miria stepped forward, her hood pushed back, revealing her silver-gold hair braided intricately. Her eyes shone in the lantern glow, reflecting relief when she confirmed it was Gaiman. He bowed politely, first to Lord Sarian, then to Miria, fumbling slightly with the cloak at his shoulders. His father's instructions echoed in his mind. Be courteous, yet reveal nothing that might commit Targaryen to a perilous position. Lord Sarian spoke in a low voice, calm but with an undercurrent of tension. He thanked Gaiman for coming on such short notice, explaining that House Magyar found itself in a precarious situation. The forging technique that had earned them notoriety was also drawing hostility from powerful corners, most notably House Valyrian. Sarian admitted that if Valyrians managed to paint Magyar as a threat to the freehold, the entire city might side against them, out of fear of imbalance. He needed to know where Targaryen stood. Gaiman listened, measuring his words. He offered the letters from Orion and Alanis, explaining that Targaryen recognized Magyar's right to innovate and had no quarrel with them, but also that Targaryen sought to preserve stability in Valyria above all. As he spoke, he felt Miria's eyes on him, watchful and probing. Lord Sarian accepted the letters, breaking the seals with careful fingers. He read them in silence, occasionally flicking his gaze toward Gaiman. In the orchard's hush, the sound of shifting leaves grew loud. Gaiman could also hear Valyrax's restless breathing from a short distance away. After some minutes, Sarian handed the letters to Miria, who scanned them as well. She nodded slightly, meeting her father's eyes. Gaiman wondered what judgments they formed at that moment. At last, Sarian spoke again, praising Orion's diplomacy and acknowledging that the Targaryens had no impetus to choose sides. But he also noted that neutrality, in times of conflict, could become its own brand of betrayal. A subtle but pointed observation. Gaiman found himself in a bind. He wanted to reassure Magyar that Targaryen had no desire to be pulled under Valyria's shadow. Yet he was painfully aware of how precarious their own position was. House Targaryen was not so mighty that it could afford to antagonize the older, more entrenched Valyria's line. So he told Sarian, as evenly as he could, that Targaryen stood for the freehold itself, and would support any house that acted in the city's best interests. Miria's gaze lingered on him, her features unreadable in the shifting lantern light. Lord Sarian exhaled quietly. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. He spoke of rumors that certain families, possibly including Valyrians, had begun sending covert support to rebel factions near Slaver's Bay. If that rumor were true, it meant a portion of Valyria's might was being siphoned away for hidden agendas. The forging demonstration, while it had revealed the Magyar's skill, might have served as a catalyst for these older families to unify against what they perceived as a new threat. Sarian insisted that House Magyar had no plan to upend the balance of power. But once suspicion started, it was difficult to quell. Miria touched Gaiman's arm, interjecting softly. She appealed to his sense of reason, describing how House Targaryen and House Magyar had certain commonalities. Both were lesser houses compared to the great pillars of Valyria. Yet each had a proud tradition with dragon. She confessed that she hoped Targaryen would see in Magyar an ally against the city's more arrogant powers. If they combined what little influence they had, perhaps they could keep Valyria from turning on itself. Her sincerity was disarming. Gaiman felt her words tugging at him, pulling him towards solidarity with her family. Yet he knew the cost. If Targaryen openly aligned with Major, Valyrians would retaliate. Even if Targaryen took a quieter approach, that might still be enough to paint a target on them. In his mind, he pictured his father's face, lined with worry as he described the precarious path that lay before them. He pictured Othar Valyrians, cold and cunning. Then he thought of Valyria itself, a city that had endured centuries of expansion, wealth, and magical might. Could it truly be undone by internal rivalries? Or was that a possibility whispered by the fearful? He weighed his words before replying, telling Miriya and her father that Targaryen stood ready to defend Valyria from any madness that might tear it apart. He pledged no direct condemnation of Valyrians, nor an overt vow of alliance with Major. Instead, he promised to counsel his father on everything said tonight, to ensure Targaryen did not fall prey to manipulation. He acknowledged that the forging demonstration had triggered tremors in the city's political foundation, and that if Valyrians sought to exploit that instability, perhaps Targaryen and Major could exchange information to thwart them. Sarion observed him a moment, then inclined his head. It was not an enthusiastic acceptance, yet it seemed to satisfy him that Targaryen was not shutting its doors. He turned to Miriya, instructing her to prepare coded correspondence that could be sent in small increments, circumventing the city's watchful eyes. She nodded, face thoughtful. Then she addressed Gaiman, explaining that if trouble escalated, House Major might request Targaryen's public stance. If that day came, she prayed Targaryen would remember tonight's conversation. Gaiman felt the orchard's shadows press in on him. The sweet scent of blossoms, once comforting, now felt cloying, as if nature itself lamented the city's tension. He swallowed. He did not want to promise the impossible, so he simply answered that he understood. In the silence that followed, an owl hooted from somewhere in the darkness, startling them with its abrupt cry. Sarion excused himself, stating he would return to the orchard's edge and give Gaiman and Miriya a moment to speak privately. Though Gaiman suspected he wanted to gauge how they interacted. The robed escort who had led Gaiman here appeared again, offering to guide Sarion through the rows of trees. Moments later, Gaiman found himself alone with Miriya under the gnarled branches. Lantern light illuminated the gentle lines of her face. Her cloak was damp at the hem, picking up dew from the grass. She admitted that she had pressed her father to invite Gaiman personally, hoping to build trust. Her voice trembled slightly when she said she feared the growing rifts in Valyria might become unmanageable. Gaiman placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. He recalled how freely she had laughed the night of the Targaryen feast, how different she seemed now, tense, guarded, as though a heavy burden lay on her. She asked about Othar Valyrians, what Gaiman knew of the man. He described the encounter at the feast, Othar's cold courtesy, his understated threat during Orion's parley. Miriya bit her lip, then murmured that House Valyrians was rumored to have a deep network of informants, even within certain forging guilds. If that rumor was correct, then Valyrians might be gathering secrets on every other house's capabilities, including Targaryen's dragons. She looked at Gaiman with a hint of desperation, as if searching for a shred of reassurance that Targaryen could stand firm if events escalated. Gaiman did not know how to comfort her. He confessed that Targaryen was not especially influential. Their pride lay in a heritage of dragons, their moderate arcane knowledge, and a legacy of standing quietly in the wings of Valyria's grand stage. But perhaps quiet fortitude was not enough anymore. The thought made his heart pound. He felt a stirring of that old desire to escape, to venture beyond the city's reach. But Miriya's eyes anchored him here, reminding him that though Valyria's intrigues were suffocating, they were also his responsibility. She lowered her gaze, then lifted her face again, determination gleaming. She asked if there might be another path, forging alliances not through the labyrinth of older families, but among the lesser houses who had grown weary of being overshadowed. Gaiman hesitated. It was true, many of the lesser houses felt stifled, yet uniting them would be no small task, especially with rumors of rebellion at the edges of the freehold. Miriya argued that if a few key families, Targaryen, Maegor, perhaps Valyrian, showed a united front, the older powers might be forced to negotiate rather than dictate. Gaiman admitted the idea had merit, though forging such a coalition would be dangerous. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, aware that robed guards could be lurking among the orchard's shadows. He asked Miria if she truly believed a reformation of sorts was possible within Valyria, or if everything was on the brink of fracturing beyond repair. She took a moment to answer, eyes distant. Then she said that her father believed in Valyria's destiny, that the city was meant to endure, shaping the world through dragonfire and arcane mastery. Yet she herself questioned whether that destiny might devour them all if they could not control it. Maybe forging a new approach, something less oppressive, more cooperative, was the only way to spare the city from a cataclysm. A flicker of deeper emotion passed between them. The orchard, with its lantern-lit blossoms, became an intimate space where hope warred with fear. Gaiman found himself wishing he could linger, speak openly of his own yearning to see lands untouched by Valyria's looming shadow. But he feared the conversation would only add confusion. Instead, he gently placed a hand over Miria's, promising that for now, House Targaryen would stay in contact, watchful, ready to help prevent a crisis if possible. They parted on a note of uncertain resolve, Miria returning to her father's side, and Gaiman heading back to Zalyrax, guided by the silent robed escort. The orchard path was dim, yet he recognized each turn by the shapes of the fruit trees. Overhead, the star-sprinkled sky appeared more vast than ever, an endless void above a city roiling with hidden tensions. At last, he emerged into the clearing, where Zalyrax craned her neck, nostrils flaring as she sensed his approach. Gaiman climbed into the saddle, double-checking that his pouch was still secure. He offered a final nod to the masked escort, who vanished back among the trees without a word. Then he directed Zalyrax upward, wings scraping branches before they cleared the treetops. A rush of cold air enveloped them, and soon the orchard shrank to a dark blot on the land below. Gaiman navigated by starlight, mindful to avoid major roads or watchtowers. He did not want word spreading of this covert flight, especially if Valyrians had watchers posted near Targaryen territory. On the return journey, he replayed the conversation in his mind. Miria's plea, Sarion's warning, the forging demonstration that had stirred the hornet's nest. And overshadowing it all was Othar Valyri's dangerous ambition. Would the city come undone if these tensions ignited? Gaiman's heart clenched. He recalled stories of the Freehold's wars of expansion, where armies of dragons had crushed entire kingdoms. If that same might turned inward, Valyria could tear itself apart. At last, the familiar profile of the Targaryen compound came into view. Its tall towers and black stone walls seemed somber in the starlight, a silent fortress waiting for him. He landed Zalyrax in the rear courtyard, noticing only 2 guards on duty there, trusted men Orion had assigned. They let him pass without question. He stabled Zalyrax himself, wiping the dragon's scales with a damp cloth to soothe the warmth of flight. Zalyrax rumbled contentedly, folding her wings. Gaiman crept inside through a narrow side entrance, footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The entire compound lay hushed in slumber, though a few lamps burned low, lighting his way. He found Alanis waiting in the small reading chamber near the library annex, dozing in a chair with a single candle on the table beside her. She startled awake at the sound of his boots, blinking blearily before rising to greet him. He described the meeting in subdued tones, keeping his voice low so as not to rouse the rest of the household. Alanis listened intently, lips pressed together as he relayed Lord Syrian's concerns, Miria's pleas, and the unspoken tension that had crackled beneath every word. When Gaiman finished, she nodded, her expression grave. She agreed that Targaryens should tread carefully. Maegir's stance was not unreasonable. They seemed genuinely alarmed by Valyria's interference. Yet that did not lessen the danger. She suggested they speak with Orion at first light. Weariness pressed on Gaiman. He realized how late it was, how his nerves remained taut after the clandestine flight and tense talk. Alanis urged him to find rest, promising she would rouse him when their father was awake. As he trudged to his chamber, he felt the hush of pre-dawn settle over the compound. It was a fragile moment, the sky just beginning to shift from black to a pale charcoal. He sank onto his bed, boots still on, and closed his eyes, lulled by a swirl of orchard scents and an undercurrent of dread. When dawn came, Alanis fulfilled her vow, knocking softly at his door. Gaiman woke with a jolt, mind still half lost in dreams of wandering through an endless orchard with no path out. She hurried him to the solar, where Orion waited, already dressed. A platter of simple fare, bread, cheese, fresh fruit, sat on the table, untouched. Orion's face bore new lines of worry, though he tried to hide his agitation as Gaiman settled into a chair. Gaiman repeated everything he had told Alanis, adding a few more details that had come to him upon waking. Orion listened in silence, occasionally taking a slow breath as if to steady himself. When Gaiman finished, Orion remained quiet a long moment, staring at the table as though searching for an answer among the crumbs of bread. At last, he asked Gaiman's opinion. Did he believe House Major truly desired only to protect Valyria and further their forging arts, or might they have ambitions of their own to challenge Balari's supremacy? Gaiman confessed that, though he could not be certain, he sensed genuine alarm from Sarian and Miria. He did not think they aspired to overthrow the existing order, so much as they feared being crushed by families who resented their new forging prowess. Alanis spoke up then, suggesting that Major might become an ally worth cultivating, but not openly. Orion nodded, noting that in the city's current state, open alliances might be seen as provocations. Better to maintain discreet contacts, share intelligence, and ensure that Valyrians could not isolate Targaryen or Major. The conversation turned to how they might glean more information about Valyria's alleged support for rebels in Slaver's Bay. If Targaryen could discover proof of those dealings, it might force Othar Valyrians onto the defensive. Yet uncovering such proof would be dangerous. Orion eyed Gaiman, cautioning him not to take any reckless actions. Gaiman promised he would not act without approval, though the spark of curiosity in him flared. What if they uncovered a plot that threatened the city's stability? Exposing it could save Valyria. But if they failed, or if they were caught, Targaryen might suffer a swift and brutal retribution. Alanis proposed quietly that they reach out to House Valyrian for support. Valyrian, while not as ancient or influential as Valyrians, retained a strong martial tradition and had a storied connection to seafaring. If Valyrians was involved in shady dealings across the sea, perhaps Valyrian's maritime networks might intercept some of that activity. Orion considered it carefully. Valyrian had attended the Targaryen feast, and they had not shown hostility. They might be the logical house to approach next, but it had to be done subtly. The morning moved on. Orion dispatched discreet letters to certain lesser lords, both to reaffirm Targaryen goodwill and to sense if any of them had heard unsettling news about Valyrians. Meanwhile, Gaiman sat with Alanis in the library annex, scanning old records of trade routes and alliances to see if House Valyrians had a history of clandestine support for foreign warlords. He found references to a conflict decades ago, when Valyrians meddled in the politics of Norvos, but nothing conclusive. Alanis found a reference to forging guild disputes that Valyrians had once funded, but again, no direct proof of sedition. Days slipped by in a swirl of cautious activity. Gaiman resumed his training, trying to keep a normal schedule, but he noticed a restless energy in the compound. Servants moved more quietly, as if afraid to draw attention. Guards stood at their posts with heightened alertness. Occasionally, Gaiman caught glimpses of newcomers, messengers from lesser houses or artisans arriving to discuss forging commissions with Targaryen smiths. Orion greeted them politely, mindful not to show partiality. A letter arrived from Miria one afternoon, brought by a courier who claimed to be delivering ordinary trade invoices. Inside, in code, she wrote that rumors in certain corners of the city suggested Valyrians had allied with two other old families, Balerian and Cenarian, each with their own claim to prestige. Combined, they might have enough sway to orchestrate an official censure of Major for disrupting the balance of forging knowledge. If the city's councils deemed Major's new technique dangerous, they could ban it, stripping Major of their advantage and condemning them in the eyes of the freehold. Miria warned that this was only the first step. If Major resisted, a more severe action might follow. Orion read the decoded letter with a grim expression. He muttered that an official censure required the support of several major families. But Valyrian was indeed capable of rallying them. And if the forging demonstration was declared illegal, who could say what punishments might be levied against Maegir, or those deemed sympathetic to them? Targaryen had never openly endorsed the forging technique, but they had shown courtesy to Maegir. That alone might be twisted into evidence of collusion. In a private talk with Gaiman, Oryne admitted he feared a slow drift towards civil strife. He asked again if Gaiman felt certain House Maegir was not fanning these flames intentionally. Gaiman confirmed that from all he had seen of Maria and Lord Syrian, they seemed more defensive than aggressive. Oryne exhaled. He had no wish to gamble Targaryen safety on mere assumptions. But the city's undercurrents allowed little space for absolute certainty. One late afternoon, Gaiman decided to ride beyond the city walls, needing a breath of open air to clear his thoughts. He saddled a small mare from the stables, an ordinary horse, not a dragon, hoping to travel quietly. He passed through the gate with minimal escort, giving the watchman a plausible reason: a short trip to assess farmland yields for the estate. Nobody questioned him. Targaryen did maintain some farmland outside Valyria. Once he was beyond the bustle of the city. Trotting along a dirt road lined with wild grasses, he felt his shoulders ease. The unrelenting tension of the city left a dull ache in his mind, replaced by the soft clop of hooves and the sweet smell of sun-warmed earth. A few miles out, he came upon a gentle slope overlooking distant fields. Here, he paused, letting the mare graze while he surveyed the horizon. The farmland seemed peaceful, dotted with thatched cottages and irrigation channels. The sense of normalcy felt jarring. If only he could linger in this pastoral calm, safe from the swirling intrigues of spires and dragons. He found himself recalling Maria's talk of forging alliances among lesser houses, wondering how many of those families toiled on farmland like this, seldom noticed by the city's powerful clans. He dismounted, guiding the mare to a small stream where she drank. The late-day sun cast a golden sheen over the rippling water. Gaiman crouched, scooping a handful to splash on his face. A mild breeze stirred the tall grasses behind him. He closed his eyes, listening to the sigh of the wind, the trickle of water. For a moment, he let himself dream that Valyria could find a way to avoid catastrophe, some solution that did not involve blood and fire. Hoofbeats sounded from the road, shaking him from his reverie. He rose swiftly, water dripping from his chin, turning to see a rider approaching. The rider wore travel-stained leathers, no visible sigil, though the horse was of good quality. Gaiman felt a twinge of caution. He rested a hand on the hilt of the short sword at his belt. The rider slowed upon seeing him and raised an empty hand in greeting. It was a young woman, dark-haired, with a guarded expression. She introduced herself as Varatha, claiming to be a wandering sellsword who occasionally transported letters for coin. Gaiman said little in response, uncertain whether she posed a threat. She asked if he hailed from a Valyrian house, gesturing to his distinctive silver-blonde hair. He answered that he served House Targaryen, choosing not to reveal his identity as heir. She nodded, remarking that she had done errands for families in the city, and that the tension there was thick enough to cut with a knife. Gaiman considered her words carefully. He asked if she heard anything of Valyrians or Maegir. Varatha snorted, saying the talk among lesser folks was that those two houses might soon come to blows, dragging whoever stood in their path into chaos. She had no direct knowledge, but she had seen anxious wariness in the city's markets. Caravans stocking extra supplies, mercenaries quietly receiving offers of gold. It was as if everyone expected a conflict that had yet to show its face. Gaiman thanked her for the candor, slipping a small coin into her hand in gratitude. She saluted lightly and continued on, dust rising from the horse's hooves. He stood alone at the stream, the water shimmering in the angled sunlight. The sellsword's casual words only confirmed the growing fear that the city might be headed for internal strife. Reluctantly, he mounted his mare and began the journey back to the Targaryen compound, his respite cut short by harsh reality. The farmland no longer seemed idyllic. Instead, it appeared vulnerable, overshadowed by the city's unstoppable thirst for power. Dusk spread across the sky as he rode through the gates. A hush greeted him in the courtyard, broken only by the shifting of stable hands attending to a few newly arrived mounts. Gaiman handed the reins over, thanking the stable boy. He noticed a faint tension in the air, the way the servants moved with clipped efficiency, as if bracing for bad news. Inside, the corridors were dimly lit by torches that cast tall shadows on the black stone. Alanis and Orion awaited him in the solar. They had received another coded message from Myria, referencing a looming meeting of certain key families at the Hall of Conclave, a place where Valyria's leading houses occasionally gathered to discuss citywide policies. Lord Sarian believed Valyrians intended to propose formal censure of Magyar's forging methods. If it passed, the city would proclaim the new forging technique too disruptive to the established order, effectively labeling major outliers. Orion feared that once a formal condemnation was made, the next step could be confiscation or forced oversight of Magyar's forges, possibly enforced by the city's vassal troops. Gaiman's mind whirled. If such a measure passed, it would not only humiliate Magyar, but also embolden Valyrians. Other houses might scramble to appease Valyrians, rather than risk sharing Magyar's fate. Targaryen, associated with Magyar only by tenuous courtesy, might become suspect. Orion pinched the bridge of his nose, murmuring that the city was unraveling faster than he anticipated. He saw two options: either stand aside and allow Valyria's motion to pass, or quietly gather enough support to block it. Neither path was safe. Alanis studied Gaiman. She asked if he thought House Valyrian might intervene, if approached properly. Gaiman paused. Valyrian had shown no hostility, but also no particular loyalty beyond formal cordiality. Still, they were known for prizing freedom of commerce and disliked excessive control by older families. Perhaps they could be persuaded that Valyria's censure set a dangerous precedent. Orion decided to send Gaiman to meet with Valyrian discreetly, accompanied by a small retinue to preserve appearances. If Targaryen could win Valyrian's cooperation in blocking the censure, that might encourage other middle-tier families to follow suit. Alanis nodded approval. Gaiman agreed, though a knot of anxiety twisted in his gut. This would be the second covert mission in a short span. But at least this time, he would be acting more openly, with a formal reason for visiting Valyrian. A discussion of potential trade routes, perhaps. Orion stressed the importance of caution. If Valyrians discovered Targaryen's efforts, they might act preemptively. Gaiman assured him that he would keep the meeting private, using minimal staff. He left the solar with Alanis, who pulled him aside in the corridor to emphasize the danger of stepping onto another house's territory without an invitation from the highest lord. Yet she also admitted that if Targaryen did nothing, Magyar would be isolated, and Valyrians would grow too strong. Gaiman nodded, feeling the burden of these decisions. Preparations began at once. A letter was drafted, couched in polite terms, requesting a dialogue with Valyrian about shared interests and potential collaborative efforts in maritime ventures. Gaiman would travel on Dragonback to expedite the journey, accompanied by 2 Targaryen guards riding lesser drakes. This would be enough show of status to avoid suspicion, but not so many as to imply aggression. The evening before departure, Gaiman stood with Valyrax in her roost, ensuring the harness and reins were in good condition. The she-dragon tilted her head, eyes flickering orange in the torchlight, as she regarded him. He stroked her scaled neck, murmuring quietly about the journey they would undertake. It felt oddly comforting to confide in her, even though she was no human confidant. She rumbled low in her throat, as if sensing his tension. Later, Gaiman found himself on the balcony overlooking the courtyard, the same place where he had once stood after the feast. A pale moon hung in the sky, painting the black stone with ghostly highlights. The compound below lay mostly quiet, save for the soft footsteps of a patrolling guard. Gaiman folded his arms on the balustrade, remembering the orchard meeting with Myria, the streamside talk with the sellsword, the swirl of half-truths and coded letters. He thought again of Westeros, of how the kings there supposedly fought each other in petty wars, but at least did not bow to Valyria. Or, so the old text claimed. He wondered if that distant land might offer a respite from the endless tension. But then, if trouble gripped Valyria now, was it not his duty to help steer House Targaryen through the storm? Abandoning the city might be an option in legends of old, but in this moment, it seemed akin to desertion. In the hush of that moonlit hour, he made a silent promise. to do what he could within reason to keep Valyria from devouring itself. If that meant forging quiet alliances, traveling to uncertain destinations, or risking the ire of Belares, so be it. He had not chosen to be heir, but the role was his. As the breeze ruffled his hair, he lifted his gaze to the sky, half expecting to see a constellation shift in warning. But the heavens were indifferent, shimmering in their distant coldness. At dawn, he gathered with his 2 accompanying guards, men he trusted, named Casaros and Geron, each with moderate skill in flying smaller dragons. They checked their gear in the courtyard. Orion arrived to see them off, offering a firm handshake to each man. He clasped Gaiman's shoulder, meeting his eyes. He did not need words to convey the significance of this mission. Gaiman nodded, confidence mingling with a tremor of nervous energy. They took flight amidst the pink-orange glow of sunrise. Zalyrax lifted Gaiman gracefully, while Casaros and Geron followed on their slender drakes. The city below sprawled in a grand mosaic. Valyria's towers gleamed in the dawnlight, the streets gradually filling with people. Dragons soared in the distance, silhouettes against the brightening sky. If one looked with a certain perspective, it was a scene of pure majesty, a testament to centuries of magical achievement. Yet Gaiman could not shake the knowledge of how brittle that majesty might be. They flew southeast, aiming for a lesser-known route that curved around one of Valyria's geothermal vents, hoping to avoid the busiest aerial lanes. After an hour in the sky, the horizon opened, revealing a patch of coastline where House Valyrian maintained their holdings. The official seat was not as massive as the grandest compounds in the city's heart, but it boasted elegant architecture that melded Valyrian artistry with a seafaring motif. Pale stone walls stretched along a bluff overlooking the sea, with tall windows catching the morning sun. Gaiman's breath quickened as they descended, mindful that any house might respond unpredictably to unannounced dragon visitors. A watchtower guard sounded a horn. Within moments, a half-dozen men and women emerged into a walled courtyard, some armed with spears, others wearing robes that denoted administrative roles. Gaiman circled once, scanning for a safe landing spot. The courtyard was spacious enough, though the watchers looked tense. Gently, he brought Zalyrax down, her wings stirring dust. Casaros and Geron followed, their dragons fanning their wings in a show of mild nerves. Gaiman dismounted, lifting his hands to show he carried no drawn weapon. One of the robed figures stepped forward, a steward, by the look of his attire. Gaiman introduced himself as Gaiman Targaryen, politely requesting an audience with Lord Valyrian to discuss potential maritime ventures. The steward blinked in surprise, then nodded, bowing in respect while still casting wary looks at the dragons. He instructed a pair of guards to escort them to a waiting chamber. Meanwhile, stable hands or dragon tenders arrived to see that the beasts could be housed near a separate enclosure. Gaiman felt sweat forming under his riding leathers. He wiped his brow discreetly, grateful that the steward had not turned them away outright. Casaros and Geron flanked him. The complex was airy, corridors open to sea breezes that carried the scent of salt and kelp. Tapestries displayed House Valyrian sigil, an elegantly curved seahorse, intertwined with draconic motifs that hinted at old Valyrian ties. They came to a reception hall with tall arches. There, Lord Aelor Valyrian awaited, flanked by a few attendants. He was tall, lean, and had the characteristic silver-gold hair, though streaked with pale gray at the temples. His eyes were a vivid blue reminiscent of the sea. He wore a robe embroidered with waves and sea serpents. At the sight of Gaiman, he lifted his chin, curiosity mingling with polite caution. Gaiman bowed formally, introducing himself, and presenting the letter from Orion. Lord Aelor accepted it, broke the seal, and read it in silence. When he looked up, Gaiman recognized a keen intellect in his gaze. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Aelor's mouth. He welcomed Gaiman with a calm graciousness, gesturing toward a set of carved chairs arranged near a wide balcony that overlooked the sea. Gaiman felt relief flood him. This was not a hostile reception. Once seated, attendants brought refreshments. Cool water flavored with lemon, thin slices of spiced fish, and bread. Gaiman sipped, letting the tang of salt air invigorate his senses. Lord Aelor asked the reason for this sudden visit. though his tone suggested he already guessed that Targaryen's interest in maritime ventures might be a veil for deeper matters. Gaiman steeled himself, choosing his words carefully. He spoke of Targaryen's admiration for Valyrian seafaring expertise and the possibility of collaborating on new trade routes. He alluded to the forging demonstration, acknowledging that times in Valyria were restless. If trouble brewed, perhaps it might affect commerce, and it would benefit their houses to coordinate. Aelir listened, tapping his fingers lightly on the arm of the chair. Then he admitted that he, too, sensed a gathering storm. He had heard rumors of a push to formally censure House Major for overstepping traditional forging boundaries. He asked Gaiman bluntly if Targaryen planned to stand by Major. Gaiman felt a flash of discomfort. He responded that Targaryen wanted to see stability for the city, and had reason to believe Baleri's approach might be extreme. Still, Targaryen was not seeking an open confrontation. Lord Aelir nodded slowly, glancing out at the rolling waves. He pointed out that if Balerians and their allies succeeded in passing a censure, it would set a precedent. Any innovation or display of initiative not sanctioned by the older houses could be crushed. Valyrian had historically valued a measure of autonomy, especially in maritime endeavors. He speculated that if Balerians gained dominance, they might seek to control more than just forging. Such an outcome did not appeal to him. At this, Gaiman felt a surge of hope. He carefully asked if Valyrian might be inclined to oppose the censure if the city's governing bodies convened for a vote. Aelir paused, eyes narrowing. He admitted that Valyrian would consider such a stance if they believed Major's forging truly posed no harm, and if they felt certain that standing against Balerians would not invite ruin. The question hung in the air. How certain was Targaryen that Balerians could be held at bay? Gaiman realized that to gain Valyrian's backing, Targaryen would have to demonstrate a plan, or at least a network of support. He confessed that while Targaryen did not command many forces, they shared Magir's desire to preserve the freehold's equilibrium. Quiet ties existed among a handful of lesser houses, who disliked Baleri's rising influence. He did not name them, though Aelir likely guessed Major was among them. Gaiman added that, from Targaryen's perspective, if the older families succeeded in stifling all innovation, they might weaken Valyria in the long run. A long silence followed. Seabirds screeched somewhere beyond the cliffside, and the rhythmic crash of waves against rock filled the airy hall. Aelir rose from his seat, pacing near the balcony's edge. He stared at the water as though drawing counsel from the sea itself. Finally, he turned to Gaiman, explaining that while Valyrian had no love for chaos, they also detested tyranny. If Baleri's agenda threatened to transform the freehold into a stagnant entity, then Valyrian would speak out. But to do so effectively, they needed more than Targaryen's word. They needed tangible proof that Major's forging method was an asset rather than a danger. And they needed assurance that enough houses might follow suit to prevent Balerians from exacting savage vengeance. Gaiman's spirits lifted. This was not an outright refusal. Indeed, it was the closest thing to a potential alliance he had seen from another house besides Major. He responded that Targaryen understood these conditions, and would endeavor to provide whatever proof Valyrian required. Aelir smiled thinly, cautioning Gaiman that time was short. There were rumors the Hall of Conclave might convene within a fortnight to address the forging controversy. Without swift action, Balerians could manipulate the forum to pass a motion of censure. They discussed further details. Aelir agreed to keep lines of communication open, providing Gaiman with a cipher for coded letters. In turn, Targaryen would gather more intelligence, especially about Baleri's alleged meddling in foreign rebellions, and discreetly share any evidence that demonstrated who the real threat to Valyria was. By the time their conversation ended, the sky had shifted from early morning gold to the deeper hue of midday. Aelir insisted Gaiman and his guards join him for a brief meal. The table was set with fish stews, salted meats, and spiced vegetables, all accompanied by a chilled white wine that tasted faintly of citrus. The cordial atmosphere put Gaiman at ease, though he remained aware that every word carried weight. As they ate, attendants refilled cups, and the conversation drifted to smaller pleasantries. The comparative flight patterns of their dragons, the sea's unpredictable storms, the best vantage points for viewing certain constellations. In these calmer moments, Gaiman glimpsed the humanity beneath the house's stiff facades. Aelor, for all his responsibilities, seemed genuinely proud of his domain and eager to protect its autonomy. After the meal, Gaiman rose to depart, politely declining Aelir's offer of lodging. He explained that returning to Valyria promptly would help maintain appearances, lest any watchers note his absence. They exchanged formal farewells in the courtyard. Aelir's parting words lingered in Gaiman's ears. "We stand with those who uphold the freehold spirit, not those who bind it in shackles. Find proof, young Targaryen, and we shall not let Valyria set the city ablaze." No remorse. Outside, Casseros and Geron waited with their dragons, each looking relieved that the meeting had proceeded without confrontation. Gaiman nodded to them, mounting Zelirax. He glanced back at the pale stone walls of Valyrian's keep. Already, the rolling sea breeze tugged at his cloak, scattering droplets of ocean spray across the courtyard. Then Zelirax launched upward, wings beating powerfully, and the coastal stronghold dropped away below. They followed a gentle arc along the coastline, gaining altitude. Gaiman cast a final look at Valyrian's domain. A cluster of towers perched at the edge of vast waters, as though forever poised between the safety of land and the mysteries of the deep. There, he had found a glimmer of hope in the shape of an alliance. Yet the tasks ahead were daunting. Proving Maegir's forging method harmless, unmasking Valyria's intrigues, rallying other hesitant houses. These matters felt like a race against time. The flight back was brisk. They aimed for the same approach route, hoping to slip into the Targaryen compound before sunset. Overhead, a few dragons from other families crossed their path, each a silhouette in the bright sky. But no one challenged them. Gaiman kept his focus on the horizon, thoughts churning. He would need to send word to Maria, urging her to share what details she could about the forging spells used by her family. The more transparency they offered, the better chance they had of persuading Valyrian and others. Yet persuading Maegir to reveal trade secrets might be delicate. When they finally alighted in Targaryen's courtyard, Orion was there to greet them, tension evident in his posture. He asked if all went smoothly. Gaiman gave a condensed account of the negotiation, noting that Valyrian was open to collaboration if Targaryen could provide evidence of Valyria's misdeeds and reassurance that Maegir posed no real threat to the city's established rules. Orion's relief was palpable, though tempered by the knowledge of how quickly the Hall of Conclave might convene. Alanis joined them in the solar, brimming with questions. Gaiman detailed Lord Eller's stance, the potential timeline, and the next steps. Alanis tapped her lips, suggesting they arrange a coded exchange with Maria at once. Orion agreed, also proposing they contact a few smaller houses that occasionally collaborated with Targaryen in trade. Perhaps if Targaryen and Valyrian took a public stand, these smaller houses would muster the courage to sign a petition against the censure. Night came on quiet wings. The compound's torches glowed against the black stone. Gaiman, exhausted from the day's flight and intense negotiations, found his bed a welcome refuge. Before sleep claimed him, he stared at the ceiling, replaying the midday conversation with Aelor. The Lord's words echoed, "We stand with those who uphold the freehold spirit." Gaiman wondered what that spirit truly was. Once, Valyria had been a beacon of innovation and freedom, albeit enforced by dragonfire. Now, it risked evolving into a place of stifling hierarchy. Perhaps the forging controversy was only a symptom of a deeper rot. In the days that followed, Targaryen's activities intensified behind closed doors. Alanis exchanged coded notes with Maria, urging greater detail on the forging process, at least enough to convince skeptics that Maegir was not forging dangerous weapons to threaten the city. Maria complied hesitantly, describing the runic layering they used, which strengthened steel without letting it become an unstable conduit for arcane forces. She included sketches of glyphs, though carefully omitted the full incantations. Gaiman and Alanis studied the diagrams late into the night, trying to understand them. Alanis had a scholarly bent, gleaning enough to see that the forging method was advanced but not inherently malevolent. They would show select parts to Valyrian's representatives, hoping it might assuage their concerns. Meanwhile, Orion discreetly contacted other moderate houses, dropping hints of a potential coalition to challenge any censure motion. Some of these lords responded with cautious approval, though others feared Valyria's wrath. The more Gaiman learned of the city's mood, the more he sensed a pervasive dread, as though everyone awaited the first spark to ignite the tinder. At last, word came that the Hall of Conclave would convene in 3 days' time. The official summons arrived, directed to each recognized Valyrian house, citing the forging dispute as a central agenda item. Orion and Alanis summoned Gaiman to the Solar to finalize their approach. They reasoned that Targaryen should attend with a small delegation, Orion, Gaiman, and Alanis, or perhaps a trusted steward. They would deliver a measured speech, pressing for a fair evaluation of Maegira's method, presenting partial evidence that it was safe and potentially beneficial. If they found an opening, they would highlight rumors of Valyria's foreign entanglements, urging caution before penalizing a domestic house. Gaiman felt a lump of anxiety in his throat. The Hall of Conclave was a grand chamber where Valyria's most influential lords gathered, often steeped in pomp and the formalities of debate. Yet behind the gilded rhetoric, alliances and rivalries erupted in abrupt shifts. He recalled the fleeting glimpses he had once had of these gatherings as a child, standing beside Orion in the gallery, watching the older families strut and posture, while lesser lords attempted to be heard. That day, Targaryen would be stepping directly into the fray, possibly provoking Valyrians. There would be no turning back once they spoke against the censure. Dawn broke on the day of the conclave, with a sense of charged stillness. Gaiman, dressed in subdued finery, a black tunic embroidered with a subtle dragon motif and silver thread, matched with breeches and polished boots. Alanis wore a flowing gray gown with delicate silver trim, her hair braided in a coronet. Orion, for his part, chose a stately robe of black and red. Together, they departed the Targaryen compound, escorted by a handful of guards who bore the house sigil. The Hall of Conclave stood in the heart of Valyria, its massive dome crowned by a sculpture of a rearing dragon. Pillars ringed the facade, carved with ancient runes. A steady procession of carriages, litters, and dragons converged on the plaza before it. Nobles disembarked, arrayed in their house colors, each stepping onto polished marble steps that led into the grand vestibule. A hush fell over bystanders as they watched the city's power brokers gather. Gaiman's stomach knotted. He saw the banners of House Valyries fluttering near the entrance. Othar Valyries had arrived, of course, accompanied by members of his retinue. Nearby, the vivid silver and crimson sigils of House Major glinted in the morning sun. Miria stood with her father, both wearing solemn expressions as they passed through the arched doors, ignoring Valyria's direction altogether. Farther down, Gaiman recognized the seahorse crest of Valyrian. Lord Aelor caught his eye, offering a subtle nod of greeting. Targaryen's turn came. They ascended the wide steps, Gaiman feeling every stare upon them. The interior of the hall was cavernous, its dome an echo chamber for footsteps. Dozens of lesser lords mingled, speaking in hushed tones, while heralds announced arrivals in stentorian voices. Orion advanced calmly, posture dignified, leading his children through the throng. A few friendly acquaintances offered curt bows, others averted their gaze, anxious about being seen with Targaryen before the matter was decided. They entered the circular chamber at the heart of the complex, where rows of tiered benches curved around a central dais. The dais held a raised lectern for speakers, behind which loomed a vast tapestry depicting Valyria's founding myth, dragons emerging from volcanic peaks to shape destiny with flame. Gaiman and Alanis took seats beside Orion in a section reserved for mid-ranked families. Lower down, closer to the dais, House Valyries occupied a prime spot, as did a few other ancient lines. On the opposite curve of the semicircle, House Major and House Valyrian sat with their respective supporters. The tension was tangible, like a cord stretched taut and ready to snap. A ringing of a ceremonial bell silenced the murmurs. An elder magister, robed in the official garb of the conclave's administrative council, stepped forward. He welcomed the assembled lords, listing the agenda. A review of proposed policies, culminating in the pressing matter of forging innovations. When he mentioned the forging demonstrations, Gaiman glanced at Miriatai. She was watching him with an unreadable expression, face partially shadowed by the tall seat behind her. One by one, minor issues were discussed. Grain allocations, road maintenance, petty disputes between small city districts. The mood grew impatient, as though all present knew the real show was yet to come. Finally, the Magister turned to the forging question, calling upon House Valyrian to state its case. Othar Valyrian stood. He wore deep sapphire robes, a gold chain at his neck. His voice resounded through the chamber with practiced assurance. He spoke of maintaining the city's stability, of how certain forging experiments might compromise the fundamental equilibrium that had allowed Valyria to flourish for centuries. He praised tradition, citing how the city's forging secrets had always been shared responsibly among recognized guilds. Veering elegantly into condemnation, he cast Maegir's forging demonstration as a reckless display of untested methods that could endanger the city. Gaiman felt anger stir in his chest as Othar continued, meticulously painting House Maegir as irresponsible mavericks. Murmurs rose from some benches. Othar's words were honeyed, but the venom beneath was unmistakable. He concluded by proposing a formal censure, requiring Maegir to cease all forging, using their new technique, until a council of older houses had deemed it safe. A flurry of applause and agreement came from certain corners, clearly allies of Valyrian. Next, the Magister called upon House Maegir to respond. Lord Targaryen stood, wearing crimson robes. His voice was composed, but simmering with indignation. He insisted that Maegir's forging was safe, that their demonstration had been attended by many, none of whom had objected to its results. He argued that stifling innovation would ultimately weaken Valyria. With a carefully controlled tone, he alluded to the possibility that the older houses, seeking to maintain their monopoly on forging lore, aimed to crush new techniques. Applause followed from the benches near Maegir, while a wave of disapproval rolled from the older families. A heated debate erupted. Lords rose to shout points about tradition versus progress, each clamoring to be heard. The Magister vainly attempted to maintain order. Othar pressed that forging knowledge should be carefully regulated, referencing historical precedents. Targaryen fired back with examples of how new forging methods had once propelled Valyria's might to new heights. Accusations flew. That Maegir was hoarding secrets, that Valyrian was power-hungry. The tapestry overhead wavered in the swirling currents of raised voices. At last, the Magister recognized Targaryen's right to speak. Orien stood, and the chamber's noise quieted somewhat. Gaiman's pulse hammered in his ears as he observed the eyes of the crowd fixed on his father. Orien addressed them with deliberate calm, thanking both sides for their views. He spoke of Targaryen's respect for tradition, acknowledging that forging knowledge was a pillar of Valyria's power. Yet he also contended that the city's success had always stemmed from pushing boundaries in magic and steel. Quashing new developments might breed stagnation. Orien then presented a condensed argument supported by partial evidence from Maegir's runic method, sketches, glyph references, demonstrating that the technique was no more hazardous than existing forging arts if properly controlled. Alenis handed him a scroll, which Orien raised for the Magister's inspection. A hush rippled through the chamber as the Magister motioned for scribes to examine it. Othar Valyrian watched with narrowed eyes, arms crossed over his chest. Orien pressed on, suggesting that before any censure was passed, a panel of impartial experts should evaluate Maegir's forging under controlled conditions. The city would benefit from understanding the method rather than discarding it outright. Orien's voice rang clear, measured. Gaiman felt a surge of pride for his father's poise. In the stands, Miria's face flickered with gratitude. A pause ensued. Lords exchanged whispers. It was a pivotal moment. Into that hush, Lord Aelor Valyrian rose, echoing Orien's sentiment. He stated that summarily condemning Maegir's technique was premature, risking the city's capacity for innovation. He called upon the Conclave to value discovery, reminding them that Valyria's greatness had come from harnessing the unknown, not shunning it. Applause burst from several benches. Gaiman saw Othar's face tighten, though he quickly masked his displeasure. The Magister then solicited opinions from others, but the tide had shifted. A number of mid-tier families, emboldened by Targaryen and Valyrian's intervention, voiced support for a more balanced approach. Gaiman recognized at least 3 houses that had sent friendly notes to Targaryen in the past weeks. Even some older houses hesitated, wary of granting Valyrian too much unchecked influence. Othar tried to counter, but the Conclave had fractured around him, no longer united in unquestioning acceptance of the censure. Eventually, after much debate, the Magister declared that the Conclave would postpone a final decision until a formal investigation was conducted. Maegir's forging technique would be tested under official supervision to confirm its safety. Valyria's censure proposal was effectively stalled, at least for the moment. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of reactions, some outraged, others relieved. Othar Valyrian offered a stiff nod, maintaining a veneer of courtesy. He thanked the Conclave for its fair hearing but warned that if any unforeseen danger emerged from Maegir's forging, those who defended it would bear responsibility. Then he stepped away, gathering his retinue. Gaiman noticed the cold fury in Othar's eyes as they flicked toward Orion. A chill ran through him. They had thwarted the immediate threat, but they had likely earned Valyria's deeper enmity. Maegir's bench erupted in subdued cheers. Sarion looked visibly relieved, though he maintained a dignified composure. Miria caught Gaiman's eye across the chamber, smiling a small, thankful smile. Orion nodded in return, turning to speak with Valyrian, who offered gracious words about Targaryen's measured stance. For a few moments, the atmosphere felt victorious, as if they had safely defused a bomb. Yet Gaiman sensed that this was only the beginning. They had checked the Valyrians in open debate, but the conflict might move into darker corridors now. Valyrians would not give up on curbing Maegir's forging art or punishing Targaryen for standing in the way. He recalled the orchard at night, Miria's quiet fear, Sarion's warnings. The city might have avoided an immediate breakdown, but the embers still glowed. The session wound down, and lords dispersed from the Hall of Conclave. Orion, Alanis, and Gaiman emerged onto the marble steps. The late afternoon sun glared, casting elongated shadows across the plaza. House Maegir stood to one side, receiving discreet congratulations from allies. House Valyrian was nowhere in sight, having departed swiftly. Valyrian lingered, exchanging pleasantries with Targaryen. Lord Eller reiterated his willingness to collaborate further, though he cautioned that the real test was still to come. If the official panel found any perceived fault in Maegir's forging, Valyrian might reignite the censure proposal. Orion thanked him, glancing at Gaiman with a mixture of pride and sober realization. Together, the Targaryens descended the steps into the bustling plaza, where lesser lords and courtiers muttered speculation about the day's events. A wave of fatigue washed over Gaiman. He longed to return to their compound, away from these watchful eyes and the swirl of rumor that was surely already spreading. They climbed into a small carriage prepared for them, leaving the Conclave's grand edifice behind. As the vehicle rumbled through Valyria's streets, Gaiman exhaled, meeting Alanis's gaze. She offered him a gentle nod, acknowledging the weight of the day. Orion remained silent for a time, staring out the carriage window at the passing spires. At length he murmured that Targaryen had stepped into a more dangerous arena than ever before. Yet perhaps it was necessary, if they were to safeguard the city's future from the stranglehold of fear. Gaiman closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the city wash over him. The clatter of wheels, the distant roar of a dragon overhead, the murmur of crowds. Valyria glowed in the setting sun, a place of wonder and peril in equal measure. He could almost sense the storms swirling beyond the horizon, waiting for the moment to unleash their fury. For now, House Targaryen had won a small reprieve, but in a realm where each choice could spark an inferno, the lines between success and doom were perilously thin.